Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first time I saw it, I blamed the lighting. My laptop screen flickered with the familiar blue glow of another endless work meeting. Faces arranged in neat rectangles like a digital gallery of the weary. I was explaining quarterly projections when movement caught my peripheral vision. A shadow crossing the hallway behind me, just at the edge of my camera's frame. The figure moved with purpose, unhurried, as if it belonged there. I turned, neck cracking from hours hunched over my desk. The hallway stretched empty, afternoon light streaming through the window at its end. Dust motes dancing in golden shafts. My apartment had been silent all day except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant murmur of traffic 12 floors below. When I faced the screen again, my colleague was asking if I'd lost connection. The meeting continued, but something cold had settled in my chest, a weight that pressed against my ribs with each breath. That evening, I walked the apartment's perimeter like a security guard making rounds. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, kitchen, living room, all exactly as they should be. The locks were secure, windows closed and latched. I lived alone on the 23rd floor. The building's security was excellent. The doorman knew every resident by name. No one could simply wander the halls. Yet I found myself checking over my shoulder as I brushed my teeth, the bathroom mirror reflecting nothing but my own tired eyes. The second incident happened during a video call with my college roommate 3 days later. We were catching up, discussing his recent promotion, when he paused mid-sentence and squinted at his screen. Dude, who was that? Who was what? Someone just walked behind you, like right behind your chair. The words hit me like ice water. I spun around so fast my office chair groaned in protest. The living room was empty, shadows falling in their usual places from the floor lamp and bookshelf. My heart hammered against my sternum. "There's no one here," I said, but my voice sounded thin, unconvincing even to myself. "That's weird, man. I swear I saw someone. Maybe it was a reflection or something." He shrugged and continued talking about his job, but I barely heard him. The call ended with me promising to visit soon, though we both knew I wouldn't. I spent that night wide awake, listening to the building's nocturnal symphony, the elevator's distant ding, water running through pipes, the settling of concrete and steel. Normal sounds that now felt loaded with possibility, each creak and whisper potentially masking footsteps in my hallway. The screenshots started appearing a week later. My friend from the gym sent the first one with a laughing emoji, a picture he'd captured during our workout video session. "Check out your fancy new art," he texted. In the image, my living room stretched behind me, but something was wrong. On the wall where I now kept only a small clock hung a large abstract painting, swirls of dark blue and black that I'd donated to charity 3 months ago. The painting dominated the frame, vivid and unmistakable, as if it had never left. I stared at the photo until my eyes watered, then walked to the wall and touched the space where the painting used to hang. Nothing but white paint and the ghost outline of its former position, barely visible in the right light. "Where did you get this photo?" I called him. "What do you mean?" "I took it 5 minutes ago during our call." "The painting. That painting isn't there anymore." A pause. "Dude, I'm looking at you right now. It's right behind you." I turned. The wall was empty except for the clock, its second hand ticking with metronomic persistence. But when I looked back at my laptop screen, at the small window showing my own camera feed, there it was. The painting, as clear as daylight, hanging exactly where it used to be. My hands shook as I ended the call. The next few days blurred together in a haze of obsessive checking. I documented everything with my phone camera, taking pictures of each wall, each corner, timestamps clearly visible. But the screenshots my friends sent during video calls told a different story. Furniture that wasn't there, decorations I'd removed, even the old leather couch I'd replaced last year lurking in the background like a ghost of better times. When I showed them my photos, They looked at me with growing concern. The evidence was clear on their screens. My apartment appeared exactly as they remembered it from months ago, complete with items I knew for certain were gone. "Maybe you should see someone," my sister suggested gently after I'd spent 20 minutes explaining the discrepancies. "You've been working too hard, sleeping poorly. Stress can do weird things to perception." But I knew what I was seeing, or rather, what I wasn't seeing. The figure became bolder after that, or perhaps I became more attuned to its presence. During a late-night call with my business partner, it appeared again, this time pausing in the hallway, turning toward the camera. The shape was humanoid but indistinct, like a person viewed through frosted glass or heavy rain. It stood there for several seconds before my partner asked if someone was visiting. I told him no one was there, but I could see it myself now in the small camera window, clear as day. The figure raised one hand, not waving, but gesturing. The motion was unmistakable, a directive pointing toward my bedroom. "Go back to the room." My mouth went dry. "Did you see that gesture?" "What gesture?" "Your friend just walked away." The figure had vanished from my peripheral vision, but in the camera feed it lingered a moment longer before dissolving into the shadows of the hallway. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed listening to the apartment breathe around me, every creak and whisper magnified in the darkness. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway, soft and measured, but when I crept to the bedroom door and peered out, I found only empty space and the glow of streetlights through the window. The worst part was the uncertainty. During the day in bright sunlight with coffee in my system and rational thoughts flowing freely, I could almost convince myself it was stress, overwork, maybe some kind of technical glitch with the camera software. But at night, in the pregnant silence of the apartment, I knew someone, or something, was sharing my space. I started avoiding video calls, claiming camera problems, scheduling issues, anything to keep from facing that window into a reality that seemed determined to rewrite itself. But work demanded face-to-face contact, and eventually I had no choice but to turn the camera back on. The figure was waiting. This time it didn't cross the hallway or linger at the edges of the frame. It stood directly behind my chair, close enough that I should have felt its presence, its breath on my neck. In the camera feed, it was crystal clear, a tall shape in dark clothing, featureless, but undeniably there. It remained motionless throughout the entire meeting, like a sentinel standing guard. No one mentioned it. Not my boss, not my colleagues, not the 3 other participants who could clearly see my feed. They continued discussing budget allocations and project timelines while this impossible presence loomed over my shoulder. When the meeting ended, I sat frozen, afraid to turn around, afraid to move. The figure in the camera window hadn't budged. Slowly, fighting every instinct screaming at me to run, I swiveled my chair. Nothing. Empty air, the scent of my morning coffee, and the faint ozone smell of electronics. But when I looked back at the screen, it was still there, and for the first time I could make out details. The suggestion of a face, pale and elongated, features that weren't quite right, spacing that defied normal human proportions. And those eyes, dark hollows that seemed to look directly through the camera, directly at me. It raised that hand again, pointing toward the bedroom with patient insistence. "Go back to the room." "What do you want?" I whispered to the empty apartment. The figure's head tilted as if considering the question. Then it turned and walked away, fading into the impossible architecture of a place that existed only in digital reflection, leaving me alone with the terrible knowledge that I was never truly alone at all. I closed the laptop and sat in the gathering dusk of my living room, listening to the building's evening sounds and wondering which version of reality was real. The one I could touch and smell and inhabit, or the one that lived in screens and screenshots, populated by things that shouldn't exist but did. The bedroom door creaked open behind me, though I knew I'd closed it hours ago. I didn't turn around. Instead, I stared at the black screen of my laptop, where my reflection watched me with eyes that might not have been my own, in a room that might not have been the one I was sitting in. The hand settled on my shoulder with the weight of absolute certainty, and I finally understood that the figure had never been behind me at all. It had been waiting inside me, looking out through cameras and screens, showing me what I'd forgotten I'd lost. guiding me back to a room I'd never really left, a place where the painting still hung on the wall and the old couch still held the shape of conversations that had ended long ago. I stood up slowly, my reflection moving in perfect synchronization, and walked toward the bedroom where something had been patiently waiting for me to remember who I really was. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and the apartment fell silent except for the whisper of digital static and the sound of someone, somewhere, ending a video call. Story 2. The first time it happened, I thought I'd hit the wrong button. I'd been living in the Meridian Towers for 3 years, long enough to know every creak in the aging elevator, every hesitation between floors. 22 stories of worn carpet and fluorescent hum, with my apartment nestled on the 14th floor like a cocoon I'd grown too comfortable in. The building had its quirks, the way the lights flickered during storms, how the heating pipes sang lullabies at midnight, but nothing that ever made me question my grip on reality, until the elevator started stopping at a floor that didn't exist. It was a Tuesday evening in October when I first noticed the button. I'd stepped into the elevator after another soul-crushing day at the insurance office, muscle memory guiding my finger toward the familiar 14 when I saw it. A small, unremarkable button labeled 0, nestled between the basement level and the first floor. The brass was tarnished, as if it had been there for decades, but I would have sworn on my mother's grave that it hadn't existed that morning. I stared at it for a long moment, my finger hovering uncertainly. The elevator's ancient gears groaned as we climbed, but instead of the familiar stops at 7, 11, and 14, the car shuddered to a halt with a mechanical sigh that seemed almost relieved. The doors opened with their usual reluctant whisper. What greeted me wasn't the beige mediocrity of my floor, but something that made my stomach twist with recognition and wrongness in equal measure. The hallway stretched before me like a funhouse mirror reflection of home. The same burgundy carpet with its constellation of stains. The same cream-colored walls bearing decades of scuff marks. Even the same brass light fixtures hanging at irregular intervals. But everything felt shifted, as if the entire floor had been nudged slightly to the left of reality. The carpet was more worn than it should have been, threads pulled and frayed in patterns that suggested heavy traffic through decades that hadn't quite happened. One of the overhead lights flickered with an erratic pulse that set my teeth on edge, casting epileptic shadows that danced across walls painted in a shade of cream that was somehow both too yellow and too gray. At the far end of the corridor, a landscape painting hung askew, not dramatically, just enough to suggest carelessness or the kind of subtle settling that happens when no one's paying attention. I should have pressed the button again, should have returned to my floor, to my apartment, to the safety of my familiar routine. Instead, I found myself stepping forward, drawn by a curiosity that felt both entirely my own and utterly alien. The silence was oppressive, thick as cotton in my ears. No distant murmur of televisions, no footsteps from neighboring apartments, no hum of electricity through the walls. Just the soft whisper of my own breathing and the muffled thud of my heart against my ribs. The air smelled wrong too. Not bad exactly, but stale in a way that suggested it had been recycled through too many lungs for too many years. I walked slowly down the hallway, my footsteps absorbed by carpet that felt somehow spongier than it should. The apartment doors were identical to those on my floor, down to the brass numbers screwed into the wood with the same slightly crooked precision. But the numbers themselves were wrong, not dramatically so, but enough to make my vision swim with confusion. Where I expected to see 1403, I found 140212. Instead of 1407, there was 140623. I stopped in front of what should have been my apartment, 1408, and found myself staring at a door marked 1407 304. The brass numbers gleamed with an oily sheen that caught the flickering light, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw my own reflection distorted in their surface, features stretched and wrong. That's when I heard it, a sound so soft it might have been my imagination, the gentle scrape of a deadbolt being turned from the inside. My blood crystallized in my veins as I watched the doorknob rotate with agonizing slowness. metal grinding against metal with a sound like fingernails on slate. I didn't wait to see what emerged. Some primitive part of my brain, the part that had kept my ancestors alive when the world was full of things with teeth, screamed at me to run. I spun around and sprinted back toward the elevator, my footsteps echoing in ways that seemed to multiply, as if the corridor was longer than it had been moments before, or as if something was matching my pace step for step behind me. The elevator doors stood open like a mouth, and I threw myself inside with enough force to rattle the ancient car. My fingers stabbed at the 14 button with desperate precision, and for a heart-stopping moment nothing happened. Then the doors groaned shut, and the elevator began its familiar ascent. When the doors opened again, I was home. My floor, my hallway. The carpet was the right shade of burgundy, worn in familiar patterns. The lights hummed their steady fluorescent tune. The painting at the end of the hall hung straight and true. But as I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking with adrenaline I couldn't quite explain, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My apartment door, 1408, stood slightly ajar. I knew I'd locked it. I always locked it. I was obsessive about security, had been ever since the break-in at my last place. I checked the lock twice every morning, jiggled the handle to make sure it was secure, but now the door hung open just wide enough to reveal a slice of darkness beyond, and from within came the faintest suggestion of movement. I pushed the door open with trembling fingers and stepped into my sanctuary, my safe space, my refuge from the world's uncertainties. Everything appeared normal at first glance. My worn leather couch still faced the television. My bookshelf still groaned under the weight of unread novels. My coffee table still bore the ring stains from countless morning cups. But something was wrong. The books had been moved, not dramatically, just a few inches here and there, as if someone had been browsing and replaced them imprecisely. The throw pillow on my couch was positioned differently, still comfortable but somehow foreign. My winter coat, which I distinctly remembered hanging in the closet, now draped across the back of my desk chair with casual familiarity. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of recent weeks was finally catching up with me. People moved things and forgot about it all the time. I'd probably grabbed the coat that morning and forgotten to put it back. The books could have shifted when the building settled. The door lock was old. It probably didn't catch properly when I left for work, but deep in my chest, a cold weight had settled like a stone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in my space, moving through my life with intimate knowledge of how things should be. Over the following weeks, the elevator continued stopping at floor 0, though not every time. The pattern seemed arbitrary, capricious. Sometimes several days would pass without incident, and then the familiar shutter would announce another unscheduled stop. Each time, the doors would open onto that wrong yet familiar corridor, and each time, I found myself stepping out despite every rational instinct screaming at me to stay away. The place began to feel familiar in the worst possible way. I learned to avoid the flickering light, which seemed to pulse with increasing frequency. I discovered that apartment 140734 was always quiet now, though I could never shake the feeling that something waited just beyond its threshold. The painting at the end of the hall gradually shifted further askew, as if the building itself was slowly tilting away from level. And each time I returned to my real floor, my real apartment, something would be different. A coffee mug moved from the kitchen counter to the coffee table. A book lying open to a page I'd never read. My bathroom mirror fogged as if someone had just showered, though the apartment was cold and still. Once, I found my toothbrush damp with water that tasted faintly of copper. I started keeping a journal, documenting every change, every displacement. The entries grew longer and more frantic as the weeks passed. October 23rd, remote control on wrong side of couch. Definitely left it on the right arm. Battery cover slightly loose. October 26th, bedroom window open approx. 3 inches. Could have sworn I locked it. Wind patterns on carpet suggest it's been open for hours. November 2nd, all clocks in apartment running 7 minutes slow. Reset them this morning, but they're slow again now, as if time moves differently here. November 8th, found hair in shower drain, dark brown, curly. My hair is straight and black. Getting locks changed tomorrow. But changing the locks didn't help. If anything, it seemed to accelerate the process. Objects moved with increasing boldness, not just displaced, but actively rearranged. I'd find my books organized by color instead of subject. My clothes folded in ways I'd never learned. My refrigerator stocked with food I didn't remember buying, brands I'd never tried. The worst part was how right it all felt. The new arrangements weren't random or chaotic. They were better, more efficient. The books looked more aesthetic, organized by color. The folding technique maximized drawer space. The food was healthier, tastier, chosen with a care for nutrition I'd never possessed. It was as if someone who knew me better than I knew myself was slowly, systematically improving my life. The realization that struck me one gray November morning was more terrifying than any supernatural explanation. I was starting to like the changes. I began spending more time on floor 0, exploring its twisted geography with a mixture of dread and fascination. The corridor never changed. The same worn carpet, the same flickering light, the same sense of something waiting just out of sight. But I started to notice details I'd missed before. The way the air moved suggested other passages, other corridors branching off into darkness. Sometimes I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that seemed to wave before dissolving into ordinary patterns of light and dark. The apartment numbered 140734 became an obsession. I spent hours standing outside its door, listening for any sound from within. Occasionally I'd hear something, the soft whisper of fabric against fabric, the gentle creak of floorboards, the distant sound of water running through pipes, normal domestic sounds that shouldn't exist in a place that shouldn't be. One evening in late November, I worked up the courage to knock. The response was immediate. Footsteps approaching the door with measured, familiar rhythm. I heard the soft scrape of someone looking through the peephole, though I saw no movement in the brass fitting. Then, silence that stretched until my nerves felt like piano wire. When the footsteps retreated, I pressed my ear against the door and heard something that made my soul contract with recognition and terror. The sound of my own voice, humming a song I'd been unconsciously humming all week. A tune I didn't recognize but couldn't get out of my head, as if it had been planted there by someone who understood the precise frequency of my loneliness. I fled to the elevator, but this time when the doors opened on my floor, I hesitated. The familiar hallway stretched before me, but it looked somehow shabby in comparison to floor 0. The carpet was the wrong shade of burgundy, too bright, too new. The lights hummed with an electrical buzz that seemed artificial after the profound silence below. Even the air smelled different, cleaner, perhaps, but lacking the depth and complexity I'd grown accustomed to. My apartment felt like a stage set when I entered. The furniture looked cheap and temporary, the decorations sparse and impersonal. It occurred to me that I'd never really made this place my own, had never invested in it emotionally or aesthetically. I'd been sleepwalking through my life, accepting mediocrity as if it were inevitable. But someone else had been paying attention. I found a notebook on my kitchen table. My handwriting, but neater than usual, more deliberate. Page after page of observations about my life, my habits, my preferences. Notes about what I ate, how I slept, what made me laugh. A careful study of the person I was, conducted with scientific precision and what might have been genuine affection. The final entry, dated that morning, consisted of a single sentence repeated 7 times. He's almost ready. I should have run, should have packed my belongings and moved to another building, another city, another life. But where do you go when the threat isn't external but existential? When the thing stalking you isn't a person but a possibility? The possibility that you're not who you think you are, that your life isn't what you remember, that the very ground beneath your feet is less solid than you'd ever dared to imagine. Instead, I waited. The elevator came for me 3 days later, on a Thursday evening when the winter wind was rattling windows throughout the building. The car shuddered to its now familiar stop, and the doors opened onto floor 0. But this time, the corridor was different, brighter. The flickering light had been fixed, casting steady illumination across carpet that looked somehow fresher, more vibrant. The painting at the end of the hall hung perfectly straight, and the door to apartment 1407 3-4 stood open. I walked toward it with steps that felt inevitable, foreordained. The movement felt less like choice than like recognition. The way you might walk toward your childhood home after decades of absence, guided by muscle memory and a longing you couldn't quite name. The apartment beyond the threshold was mine. Not similar to mine, not a twisted reflection, but literally mine. Every piece of furniture, every book, every coffee ring on the table. Except it was better. The colors were richer, the arrangement more pleasing to the eye. The air smelled like the cologne I'd stopped wearing years ago because I thought it was too expensive for everyday use. Books lay open to passages I'd always meant to read. The kitchen counter bore evidence of meals I'd always wanted to learn to cook. A figure sat in my chair with his back to the door, reading my newspaper in the lamplight. He didn't turn when I entered, but I could see enough of his profile to recognize the features I saw in the mirror every morning. If that mirror had shown me a version of myself who exercised regularly, who ate well, who had never given up on the dreams that once seemed achievable. When he finally spoke, his voice was mine, but warmer, more confident. "I've been waiting for you," he said without turning around. "We have so much to discuss." I wanted to run, to scream, to demand explanations that would make sense of the impossible. Instead, I found myself moving closer, drawn by curiosity and a hunger I hadn't realized I possessed. The hunger to meet the person I might have been, could still become, with the right guidance. The newspaper he was reading was dated 3 months in the future, and in the obituaries section, circled in red ink, was my name. But I was no longer certain which one of us it referred to. As I reached for the paper, the elevator doors closed behind me with the finality of a coffin lid, and I realized that I had never been the one making the choice to visit floor 0. I had been the one being visited. The apartment above had been the reflection, the pale copy, the rough draft of a life still being written. The question that remained, the question that follows me now as I write this from an apartment that exists nowhere and everywhere, is not whether I'm going insane. The question is whether I ever wasn't. Story 3. The first time I found the table set for 2, I assumed the previous tenant had left it that way. It was my 3rd day in the apartment. Boxes still scattered across the hardwood floors like cardboard tombstones. The move had been sudden. A job transfer that gave me exactly 2 weeks to uproot my life and relocate to this cramped studio on the east side. The landlord had mentioned the last tenant moved out in a hurry, something about family circumstances, but the details were vague in that way that made me wonder what he wasn't telling me. The dining table sat in the narrow space between the kitchenette and the single window that faced the brick wall of the adjacent building. 2 plates, pristine white against the dark wood. 2 sets of silverware aligned with mathematical precision. 2 glasses, empty but bearing the telltale rings of condensation that suggested they'd recently held something cold. I swept it all into the sink without much thought. Moving made people forget things. But when I came home from work the next evening, the table was set again. Same arrangement. Same ghost water rings on the glasses. This time, though, I noticed the napkin on the left side was crumpled, as if someone had dabbed their mouth and carelessly tossed it back down. The fork bore a small smudge near the handle. Not dirt exactly, but the kind of mark fingers leave behind. I stood in the doorway for several minutes, apartment key still clutched in my hand, listening to the building's arthritic groans and the distant murmur of traffic. The sensation of being watched crept up my spine like cold fingers, but when I turned to scan the studio, I found only shadows and the amber glow of the single overhead lamp I'd left burning. The building was old, probably from the 1940s, with thick walls and the kind of solid construction that trapped sounds and smells from decades past. Sometimes I caught whiffs of cigarette smoke, though smoking had been banned in the building for years. Sometimes I heard footsteps above me, though I lived on the top floor. Old buildings had their quirks, I told myself. Old buildings held on to things. I cleared the table again, this time examining each piece more carefully. The plates were cheap ceramic, the kind you might find at any discount store. The silverware was mismatched. A fork from one set, a knife from another. Nothing special, nothing that couldn't be explained. That night, I installed a security camera. The device was small, no bigger than a golf ball, designed to stream directly to my phone. I positioned it on the bookshelf with a clear view of the dining area and synced it with the apartment's Wi-Fi. The app promised instant notifications for any movement, along with night vision and crystal clear footage. For the next 3 days, the table remained empty when I returned from work. The camera showed nothing, just hours of still footage, the dining area bathed in the dim light that filtered through the single window. I began to feel foolish for the whole setup, imagining explanations that didn't involve supernatural intervention. Maybe I'd been setting the table myself in some kind of fugue state, stress from the move playing tricks with my memory. But on the 4th night, the table was set again. I checked the camera immediately, hands trembling as I scrolled through the day's footage. Hour after hour of empty frames. The timestamp showed continuous recording, no gaps or glitches. Yet somehow, between 3:17 p.m. when the table was bare and 6:42 p.m. when I'd walked through the door, 2 place settings had materialized. The camera had captured nothing. I added 2 more cameras, positioning them at different angles to eliminate any possible blind spots. I set motion sensors near the windows and the door. I even installed a smart lock that would notify me if anyone entered with a key. For a week, everything remained normal. The table stayed empty. The cameras recorded nothing but stillness and shadow. I began to sleep better, convinced I'd solved whatever strange coincidence had been plaguing the apartment. Then came the sounds. The first time I was in the shower when I heard them, a soft clinking, like silverware being gently placed on ceramic. I shut off the water and stood perfectly still, soap suds trailing down my chest, listening. The sounds had stopped, but when I wrapped a towel around my waist and padded to the dining area, the table was set. The cameras showed nothing. The motion sensors hadn't triggered. The door remained locked. But this time, one of the glasses was half full of water. I called the landlord, a gruff man who spoke in clipped sentences and seemed perpetually irritated by tenant concerns. When I described the situation, he was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. "You said the table gets set?" he finally asked. "Every few days. Always the same way. But my cameras don't show anyone entering the apartment." Another long pause. The previous tenant mentioned something similar. My stomach clenched. What did he say exactly? Called it a dinner guest. Said someone was eating with him every night, but he could never see who it was. Thought maybe it was his late wife, trying to tell him something. The landlord's voice carried a note of dismissal, as if he were recounting the ravings of someone clearly unhinged. He moved out pretty quick after that. The line went dead. I spent that evening researching the building's history, diving deep into property records and newspaper archives. The building had stood for 83 years, housing hundreds of tenants across dozens of apartments. Nothing unusual in the records. No deaths, no disappearances, no incidents that might explain why someone or something would feel compelled to set my table for dinner every few days. But that night, at exactly 8:17 p.m., I heard the dishes. I was sitting on the couch, laptop balanced on my knees, when the sound drifted from the dining area. Not the gentle clink of silverware this time, but the distinct noise of plates being stacked. Ceramic sliding against ceramic with that particular hollow resonance that comes from empty dishware. I crept toward the dining area, bare feet silent against the hardwood. The sounds continued, steady and methodical, as if someone were clearing away a meal and organizing the cleanup. But when I rounded the corner, the table was empty. The sounds stopped immediately. I stood there for several minutes, heart hammering in my chest, watching the empty table as if it might suddenly spring to life. The silence felt thick, oppressive, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air itself seems to hold its breath. Then I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, almost subliminal, the lingering aroma of a home-cooked meal. Something with herbs and garlic, maybe roasted vegetables. The kind of smell that usually makes your mouth water and reminds you how hungry you are. But in that empty apartment with no food in sight and no explanation for its presence, the scent felt wrong. Invasive. I checked the cameras again. Nothing. The footage showed me moving through the apartment, then standing alone in the dining area, apparently staring at nothing. But I could smell that phantom meal, could hear those phantom dishes, could feel the presence of someone just beyond the edge of perception. Over the following weeks, the incidents escalated. The table would be set when I woke up in the morning, plates arranged with the precision of a formal dinner service. Sometimes I'd find a single breadcrumb on one of the plates, or a water ring that was still damp to the touch. Once I discovered a few grains of salt scattered next to the left-hand place setting, as if someone had been seasoning their food. The sounds became more frequent and more varied. I'd hear the soft scrape of a chair being pulled out from the table, followed by the subtle shift of weight settling into the seat. Sometimes there would be the delicate clink of a fork against a plate, or the soft rustle of a napkin being unfolded. Always at 8:17 p.m., always lasting exactly 4 minutes. I started timing the episodes, recording detailed notes about each occurrence. The pattern was consistent, almost ritualistic in its precision. Whatever was happening in my apartment followed rules, maintained a schedule, operated according to some internal logic I couldn't decipher. But the cameras captured none of it. I brought in a friend from work, someone who dealt with security systems professionally. He examined my setup, tested the equipment, even stayed for an evening to witness the phenomenon firsthand. When 8:17 arrived and the sounds began, clear and distinct to my ears, he looked at me with growing concern. "I don't hear anything," he said quietly. That night, after he left, I sat at my computer and reviewed every frame of footage from the past month. Hours of empty apartment, hours of me moving through my daily routines, hours of nothing happening at all. But I knew what I'd experienced. I knew what I'd heard and seen and smelled. The alternative was that I was losing my mind. I consulted a doctor, described my symptoms in clinical terms that made them sound less supernatural and more neurological. Sleep deprivation, I suggested. Stress from the move. Maybe some kind of auditory hallucination brought on by the isolation of living alone for the first time in years. The doctor ordered tests, blood work, brain scans, psychological evaluations. Everything came back normal. My brain was functioning perfectly. My stress levels were within acceptable ranges. There was no medical explanation for what I was experiencing. But the dinner guests continued their visits. I began leaving offerings on the table, a bowl of fruit, a loaf of bread, a bottle of wine. Somehow I thought that if I acknowledged the presence, if I showed respect for whatever ritual was being performed in my dining area, maybe the incidents would feel less intrusive. Maybe I could find a way to coexist with whatever shared my apartment. The offerings were never touched, but they seemed to change the dynamic somehow. The table settings became more elaborate, more carefully arranged. Sometimes I'd find a flower, always a single white carnation, placed beside one of the plates. I had no idea where the flowers came from. I'd never bought any, and none of the neighbors I'd managed to meet seemed like the type to leave floral gifts for strangers. 3 months into my lease, I decided to stay up and watch. I positioned myself on the couch with a clear view of the dining area and waited for 8:17 p.m. When the time came, I watched the empty table and listened as the familiar sounds began. The scrape of the chair, the soft clink of silverware, the gentle rustle of movement. But this time, I saw something else. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. A shift in the way the light fell across the table, as if something were casting a shadow without being there to cast it. The air shimmered slightly, the way heat distorts vision on a summer day, and for just a moment I could swear I saw the outline of a figure seated in the left-hand chair. Not solid, not real in any way I could quantify, but present nonetheless. A suggestion of shoulders, the hint of hands folded on the table, the impression of someone sitting quietly and enjoying a meal I couldn't see. I blinked, and the impression vanished. But the sounds continued for another 3 minutes, exactly as they always did. When 8:21 arrived and the apartment fell silent again, I walked to the dining area and examined the table closely. The left-hand chair was pushed out slightly from its usual position, and when I placed my hand on the seat cushion, it was warm. I moved out the following week. The new apartment is in a different neighborhood, a modern building with thin walls and neighbors who play music too loud and fight too often. There's no dining area, just a breakfast bar with stools that wobble when I sit on them. I eat most of my meals standing at the kitchen counter, scrolling through my phone and trying not to think about place settings or phantom dinners or the weight of an invisible presence sharing my space. But sometimes, when I'm washing dishes in the sink, I catch myself setting out 2 plates instead of 1. And sometimes, at exactly 8:17 p.m., I hear the soft clink of silverware from somewhere behind me, even though I live alone and always will. The cameras in my new place show nothing unusual. They never do. But I've stopped watching them. Story 4. The antique store smelled of dust and forgotten years, each item carrying the weight of someone else's discarded memories. I hadn't intended to buy anything that Tuesday afternoon, just killing time before my evening shift at the warehouse. But the mirror caught my attention from across the cluttered shop, its ornate bronze frame tarnished with age, yet somehow commanding presence among the scattered furniture and yellowed photographs. The elderly proprietor, a woman with paper-thin skin and clouded eyes, accepted my $50 without much conversation. She wrapped the mirror in old newspaper, her gnarled fingers moving with surprising efficiency. As I lifted it, she mentioned something about it coming from an estate sale, but her words were lost in the jingle of wind chimes hanging near the door. My apartment felt smaller with the mirror propped against the living room wall. I'd planned to hang it above the couch, but exhaustion from the day's work convinced me to leave that task for tomorrow. The bronze frame caught the lamplight, casting elongated shadows across the hardwood floor. That first night, I noticed nothing unusual. The delay started 3 days later, subtle enough that I initially dismissed it as fatigue playing tricks on my perception. I'd raise my hand to scratch my beard, and for the briefest moment, my reflection would lag behind. Not by much, maybe half a second, but enough to create an unsettling disconnect. I attributed it to the mirror's age, perhaps some imperfection in the glass causing optical distortion. But the lag grew more pronounced. By the end of the week, the delay stretched to nearly 2 seconds, long enough for me to notice my reflection moving independently of my actions. I'd turn my head left, and my mirrored self would continue staring straight ahead before eventually following suit. The sensation was like watching a poorly dubbed foreign film, where the audio never quite synced with the moving lips. I tested it repeatedly, waving my arms, blinking deliberately, even jumping in place. Each time the reflection followed with that same maddening delay. I considered returning the mirror to the antique shop, but something held me back, a morbid curiosity about what else might happen. The first object appeared on a Thursday evening. I'd been standing before the mirror, brushing my teeth before bed, when my reflection suddenly turned its head toward the kitchen corner, not following my movement, but leading it, looking at something that wasn't there. Compelled by an impulse I couldn't name, I followed my reflection's gaze to the shadowy space behind the refrigerator. There, covered in a fine layer of dust yet somehow appearing recently placed, sat my missing coffee mug, the one with the chipped handle that I'd been searching for since last month. The dust was fresh, almost powdery, as if it had been sitting there for weeks but had only just accumulated its coating. I stared at the mug for a long time, turning it over in my hands. The chip was exactly as I remembered, the faded logo still visible on the ceramic surface. But how had it gotten behind the refrigerator? I distinctly remembered using it the morning it disappeared, setting it on the counter while I rushed to work. I'd searched every cabinet, every possible hiding place. The space behind the refrigerator was too narrow for the mug to have simply fallen there. Sleep came fitfully that night. I kept the bedroom door open, maintaining a clear sight line to the living room where the mirror stood sentinel in the darkness. Streetlight filtered through the window blinds, casting parallel lines across the glass surface. Several times I could have sworn I saw movement in the reflection, subtle shifts in shadow that didn't correspond to anything in the actual room. The second discovery happened 3 days later. This time my reflection's independent gaze directed me toward the space beneath the dining table. There, pushed far back against the wall, I found my reading glasses, the expensive prescription pair I'd assumed were lost forever. They were clean, spotless, as if someone had carefully polished them before placing them in that impossible-to-reach corner. The pattern became clear over the following weeks. My reflection would turn its attention to various corners of the apartment, always with that deliberate, knowing look. And always, I would find something that had been missing. A pen I'd lost months ago, discovered behind the bookshelf, a key ring found tucked beneath the couch cushions, a watch that materialized in the bathroom cabinet, wound and keeping perfect time despite having been missing for 2 months. Each object bore the same characteristics: covered in fresh dust, immaculately clean despite their supposed hiding places, positioned in locations that defied logical explanation. The pen had been behind books I'd recently moved while cleaning. The key ring was in a cushion I'd flipped countless times looking for loose change. The watch had appeared in a cabinet I opened daily for vitamins. I began spending hours studying the mirror, watching for any indication of what my reflection might reveal next. The delay had grown to nearly 5 seconds now, creating an almost conversational rhythm between my movements and my mirrored self. Sometimes I would catch my reflection making expressions I hadn't made. Subtle tilts of the head, slight movements of the eyes, as if it were responding to something beyond my perception. The sensation of being watched intensified, not by the mirror itself, but by something behind it, something using the glass surface as a window into my world. I found myself checking locks obsessively, examining windows for signs of intrusion, searching for rational explanations that consistently eluded me. One evening, I decided to test the mirror's apparent intelligence. I deliberately misplaced my wallet, hiding it in the bedroom closet behind a stack of sweaters. Then I stood before the mirror, waiting. My reflection stared back for several minutes before slowly turning its head toward the kitchen. But there was nothing in the kitchen corner. I'd already checked. Confused and slightly disappointed, I went to bed. The next morning, I found my wallet in the kitchen corner, exactly where my reflection had indicated. But I'd hidden it in the bedroom closet. I rushed to the closet, pushing aside the sweaters. Nothing. The wallet had somehow traveled from one room to another overnight, crossing a locked apartment with no explanation. That's when I first attempted to cover the mirror. I draped a thick blanket over the entire surface before leaving for work, securing the edges carefully to ensure complete coverage. The fabric felt substantial, opaque enough to block any possible reflection. I even tested it, standing where the mirror would be visible, confirming that no part of the glass remained exposed. When I returned home 8 hours later, the blanket lay neatly folded on the coffee table, not thrown aside or hastily removed, but folded with deliberate precision, each corner aligned perfectly. The mirror stood uncovered, its surface gleaming as if recently cleaned. My hands trembled as I examined the glass. There, pressed into the surface like signatures in wet cement, were fingerprints. Not smudges or casual marks, but deliberate prints impressed into the mirror itself. I compared them to my own fingers, holding my hand up to match the patterns. They were close but not identical, similar enough to be related, different enough to belong to someone else. The prints covered the lower portion of the mirror, concentrated around the center as if someone had been pressing their palms against the glass from the other side. But that was impossible. The mirror hung flat against the wall, with barely an inch of space behind it. No one could have accessed the reverse side without moving the entire piece. I called in sick to work the next day and spent hours researching antique mirrors, optical illusions, anything that might explain what I was experiencing. The internet offered theories about temporal distortions, parallel dimensions, and psychological breaks from reality. None felt adequate to explain the physical evidence, the recovered objects, the folded blanket, the impossible fingerprints. That night, I positioned myself directly in front of the mirror and spoke aloud, feeling foolish but desperate for answers. I asked who was there, what they wanted, why they were showing me these things. My reflection mimicked my lip movements with the usual delay, but offered no additional responses. The apartment remained silent, except for the familiar sounds of settling pipes and distant traffic. As days passed, the mirror's behavior grew more complex. My reflection would sometimes remain perfectly still while I moved, creating the disconcerting image of my frozen self staring back while my actual body gestured frantically. Other times, it would continue moving after I'd stopped, completing actions I'd only begun. The objects appeared more frequently now, and not just lost items from my own past. I found things I'd never seen before: a fountain pen with someone else's initials engraved on the barrel, a jewelry box containing a locket with a stranger's photograph, a leather journal filled with handwriting that wasn't mine. These foreign objects appeared in the same corners where my reflection directed its attention, always accompanied by that telltale fresh dust. Reading the journal became an obsession. The entries, written in a careful script, described experiences remarkably similar to my own. A delayed reflection, objects appearing in corners, the growing certainty that something existed on the other side of the glass. The final entry, dated 3 years ago, expressed fear about the blurring boundaries between what was real and what existed only in the mirror's reflection. I tried to research the journal's author, searching online for any missing person reports or unusual incidents from 3 years ago. The investigation led nowhere, but the journal's description of events matched my own experience with disturbing precision. Whoever had written those words had stood in this same position, watching their reflection act independently, questioning their sanity just as I was questioning mine. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night, exactly 1 month after I'd brought the mirror home. I'd fallen asleep on the couch while reading, and I woke to find myself standing directly in front of the mirror. Not sitting up and walking over, standing, as if I'd been there for some time. My reflection, however, remained in a sleeping position on the couch, head tilted back, mouth slightly open. We were completely disconnected, existing in 2 different states simultaneously. Panic flooded my system as I tried to step away from the mirror, but my reflection remained motionless on the reflected couch. I waved my arms frantically, but my mirrored self continued sleeping peacefully. Only when I moved back to the exact spot where I'd awakened did my reflection finally stir, slowly sitting up and matching my current position. The next morning, I found evidence of my nocturnal standing vigil, indentations in the carpet where my feet had been, deep impressions suggesting I'd stood in that spot for hours. But I had no memory of getting up, no recollection of moving to the mirror. The lost time frightened me more than any of the previous incidents. I began sleeping in the bedroom with the door closed, but even there I could sense the mirror's presence through the walls. Sleep became elusive, interrupted by dreams of walking through my apartment while watching myself sleep in the reflection. The boundaries between waking and dreaming, between real and reflected, had begun to dissolve. 3 days later, I discovered the note. It was written in my own handwriting, placed on the kitchen counter where I'd surely notice it. But I had no memory of writing it. The message was simple: stop fighting what you already know. I compared the handwriting to my own writing samples, examining the letter formations, the pressure patterns, the distinctive way I crossed my T's. It was undeniably my penmanship, yet I had no recollection of forming those words. The ink was still slightly wet when I found it, suggesting it had been written recently, possibly while I slept. That evening, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I would stay awake all night, maintaining constant watch over the mirror, documenting everything that happened. I positioned myself on the couch with a clear view of the glass surface and began my vigil. For the first few hours, nothing unusual occurred. My reflection followed my movements with the familiar delay, occasionally directing its attention toward corners of the room. I noted each instance in a notebook, tracking the timing and direction of these independent actions. Around midnight, something changed. My reflection stopped following entirely. It remained seated on the reflected couch while I stood and walked around the room. But more disturbing was what I could see in the reflection itself, objects in the mirror's version of my apartment that didn't exist in the real space. A different arrangement of furniture, unfamiliar photographs on the walls, a figure moving in the background of the reflected room. The figure was human-shaped, but indistinct, always remaining just outside the clear focus of the mirror. It moved with purpose through the reflected apartment, searching through drawers, examining objects, occasionally pausing to look directly at the mirror's surface, directly at me. I approached the mirror slowly, trying to get a clearer view of this impossible visitor in my reflected world. As I drew closer, The figure in the mirror approached as well, moving toward the reflected surface from its side. We met at the glass simultaneously, and for one terrifying moment, I could see its face clearly. It was my own face, but older, more weathered, with eyes that held a desperate kind of knowledge. This other version of myself pressed its palms against its side of the mirror, and I watched the fingerprints form on my side of the glass, the same prints I'd discovered before, now being created in real time. The other me mouthed words I couldn't hear, pressing harder against the glass as if trying to break through. Behind him in the reflected apartment, I could see more figures moving. Other versions of myself, perhaps, or other people entirely. They all seemed urgent, desperate, trying to communicate something vital. I pressed my own hands against the mirror, feeling the cold glass against my palms. For a moment, the surface felt less solid, more like pressing against thick water. The temperature dropped noticeably, and my breath began to fog the glass, obscuring the view of the other side. When the fog cleared, the reflected apartment was empty again. My reflection had returned to normal, mimicking my movements with the usual delay. But the fingerprints remained, covering both sides of the glass now, mine on this side, theirs on the other. I spent the remainder of the night researching parallel dimensions, mirror worlds, anything that might explain what I'd witnessed. The scientific explanations felt inadequate compared to the visceral reality of what I'd experienced. But the alternative, that I was losing my mind, hallucinating elaborate scenarios, seemed equally implausible given the physical evidence. As dawn approached, exhaustion finally overwhelmed my vigilance. I dozed fitfully on the couch, waking periodically to check the mirror. Each time, my reflection appeared normal, following my movements appropriately. But something had fundamentally changed during that midnight encounter. The apartment felt different now, as if the boundaries between real and reflected had permanently shifted. Objects appeared in new locations daily, not just lost items, but things that seemed to belong to the other versions of my apartment. A book I'd never purchased, a coffee cup with an unfamiliar design, a jacket that fit perfectly despite not being mine. I stopped going to work, unable to concentrate on anything beyond the mirror's mysteries. My savings provided enough cushion for several weeks, and I convinced myself I needed that time to understand what was happening. The rational part of my mind recognized the danger in this obsession, but that voice grew quieter each day. The journal entries from the stranger began making perfect sense. Like me, they'd become consumed with the mirror's impossible properties. Like me, they'd lost time, found objects, experienced the delayed reflection. Their final entries described a growing certainty that the mirror wasn't showing a reflection at all, but rather a window into a parallel space where slightly different versions of reality played out simultaneously. I began writing my own journal, documenting each incident with scientific precision. The pattern that emerged suggested the mirror operated on some kind of cycle, with periods of normal reflection interrupted by increasingly frequent episodes of independent behavior. The fingerprints multiplied daily, creating a palimpsest of impressions that covered nearly the entire surface. One evening, while studying these prints, I noticed they weren't random. When viewed as a whole, they formed a deliberate pattern, almost like a message written in a language of pressed palms and searching fingers. The arrangement suggested urgency, perhaps desperation, as if whoever was on the other side was trying to spell out something vital using only their handprints. That realization led to my final experiment. I decided to respond in kind, pressing my own hands against different areas of the mirror in what I hoped might form a coherent reply. The glass felt different during this process, warmer, more yielding, as if the barrier between worlds was thinning. My handprints joined the others, creating a complex dialogue of pressed palms and searching fingers. The response was immediate. The entire surface of the mirror began to shift, not like glass reflecting light, but like liquid disturbed by movement beneath its surface. Ripples emanated from where my hands touched, spreading across the entire frame. The reflection dissolved into something that wasn't quite image and wasn't quite reality, a space that existed between both states. Through this fluid barrier, I could see them clearly now. Not just one other version of myself, but dozens, all standing in their own variations of my apartment. Some appeared younger, others older. Some wore clothes I recognized, others dressed in styles I'd never chosen. All were watching me with the same mixture of fascination and terror I felt watching them. One of them, the one I'd seen most clearly before, stepped forward and pressed both hands against his side of the barrier. When I matched his gesture, the surface between us became almost transparent. I could hear his voice, faint but distinct, speaking words that chilled me to the bone. "You have to stop looking," he said, his expression urgent with warning. "The more you watch, the thinner it gets. Soon there won't be any barrier at all." Behind him, I could see the others nodding in agreement, their faces reflecting the same desperate concern. Some were gesturing frantically, pointing at their own mirrors, which I now realized showed views into even more apartments, more variations, an infinite regression of reflected realities. "What happens if it gets too thin?" I asked, though I wasn't sure if my voice would carry through. His response was barely audible, but the words struck with absolute clarity. "Then we're all in the same place." The implications hit me with nauseating force. The mirror wasn't just showing other realities, it was slowly merging them. Each observation, each interaction, each moment of contact wore away the barriers between these parallel spaces. The objects appearing in my apartment weren't traveling from their world to mine. They were manifestations of reality bleeding together. I pulled my hands away from the glass, and immediately the surface returned to normal reflection. But the knowledge remained, terrible and undeniable. Every day I spent watching the mirror. Every moment I engaged with its impossible properties. I was contributing to some kind of dimensional erosion that would eventually collapse all these realities into one chaotic space. The smart choice would be to remove the mirror immediately, to break the cycle before it progressed further. But as I stood there staring at my now normal reflection, I realized the horrible truth that my other selves had been trying to communicate. It was already too late. The objects in my apartment weren't just from other realities anymore. They belonged to all realities simultaneously. The handprints on the mirror weren't separate messages from different versions of myself. They were evidence that we were already beginning to occupy the same space. The lost time, the mysterious note in my handwriting, the feeling of being watched, all were symptoms of a reality that was slowly fragmenting under the weight of too much observation. I write this now as a record of what I understand, though I'm no longer certain which version of myself is doing the writing. The mirror shows my reflection normally again, but I can feel the others here in the apartment with me, invisible but present, occupying the same physical space from slightly different dimensional angles. Sometimes I catch glimpses of them in my peripheral vision, and sometimes I find evidence of their activities. Books move to different shelves, food missing from the refrigerator, the shower still warm when I wake up in the morning. We're learning to coexist in this slowly collapsing space, but I don't know what will happen when the last barriers finally dissolve completely. The mirror still hangs on my living room wall. Sometimes its reflection shows my apartment as it is now. Sometimes it shows the variations where my other selves live. And sometimes, increasingly often, it shows something else entirely. A space that belongs to none of us, where all our realities have merged into something new and strange and impossible to navigate. I should warn others about the mirror, about the danger of too much observation, about the fragile nature of the barriers between what is and what might be. But I can't bring myself to leave the apartment, and I'm no longer sure if I'm the version of myself who originally bought the mirror or one of the others who has slowly bled through into this space. The only certainty is that the reflection delay has disappeared entirely now. When I move, my mirrored self moves with perfect synchronization. We are finally, terrifyingly, existing in exactly the same moment. And in the corners of the apartment, new objects appear daily. Things that belong to none of us. Artifacts from realities that haven't fully formed yet. Evidence of whatever comes next when all the barriers are gone. Story 5. The fog rolls in like smoke from a dead cigarette, curling around the rusted tracks and broken concrete of what used to be Millbrook Station. I shouldn't be here. The place has been abandoned for 15 years, maybe 20, sealed off after the accident that nobody talks about anymore. Yet here I stand on Platform 0, a designation that makes no sense because platforms are numbered starting from 1. The silence presses against my eardrums like deep water. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seems to hold its breath in this place. The air tastes of metal and something else. Something sweet and wrong that makes my stomach clench. I run my tongue across my lower lip and taste copper. I don't remember walking here. I don't remember deciding to come. The last clear memory I have is sitting in my apartment, staring at the television static because I couldn't afford cable anymore. Now I'm standing in a place that shouldn't exist, wearing shoes that are damp with dew, though I can't recall stepping through wet grass. The station building looms to my left, its windows boarded with plywood that's warped and water-stained. Graffiti covers the lower walls. Tags and symbols I don't recognize, written in what looks like rust-colored paint. Some of the markings seem to shift when I'm not looking directly at them, rearranging themselves into different patterns that make my eyes water. A sound breaks the silence. Static. The kind that comes from old speakers before they crackle to life. The voice, when it comes, is crystal clear despite emerging from speakers that look like they haven't worked since the Reagan administration. It's a woman's voice, professional and warm in that artificial way of public announcements. Passenger boarding at Platform 0, final boarding call for the 11:47 service to... The words fade into static, but I catch the last part clearly. My name. She calls my name like she knows me, like she's been waiting. I check my watch. It's 12:15 a.m. The 11:47 has already left, if it was ever coming at all. My breath comes out in visible puffs, though the night isn't cold. The vapor hangs in the air longer than it should, forming shapes that almost look like letters before dissipating. I step backward, my heel catching on something that scrapes across the concrete. A newspaper, the Millbrook Herald, folded neatly as if someone just set it down. The date at the top makes my chest tight. Tomorrow's date. Not just tomorrow plus one day. A Thursday that hasn't happened yet. I pick it up with trembling fingers. The paper feels real enough. Rough newsprint that smudges my fingertips with ink. The headlines are mundane. City council votes on library funding. High school football team prepares for championship. Normal things that could happen in any small town on any Thursday. But tucked between the fold, written on a small piece of lined paper in blue ink, is a note. You're late again. The handwriting is familiar. Uncomfortably familiar. It looks like my own. I've never been to this station before. I'm certain of that. I grew up 40 miles from here and only moved to Millbrook 6 months ago for a job that lasted 3 weeks before the company folded. I don't even know where this place is in relation to the main rail line. Yet the note suggests this isn't my first visit. The speakers crackle again. This time the static resolves into something that might be music. A melody I can't place but that raises goosebumps along my arms. It's the kind of tune you might hear in an elevator, pleasant and forgettable. Except here it sounds wrong. The tempo is slightly off, the notes bending in ways that hurt to follow. Movement catches my eye. Something large and dark sliding along the tracks beyond the platform's edge. A train. It moves without sound, a massive shadow gliding through the fog. No rumble of wheels on steel, no mechanical grinding, no whistle. Just the shape of it passing like a held breath. The windows are lit from within, revealing silhouettes of passengers who sit too still to be alive but too rigid to be sleeping. As it passes, the train's rhythm creates a pattern. Clickety-clack, pause, clickety-clack, pause. But the pauses are too long, the clicks too sharp. It sounds like Morse code. It sounds like someone tapping on glass. It sounds like my name being spelled out one letter at a time. The train stops. The doors don't open. They don't hiss or slide or make any mechanical sound. They simply become open, as if they were always meant to be that way. Yellow light spills onto the platform, warm and inviting despite everything wrong with this place. I can see inside now. The seats are arranged in the old-fashioned style, 2 by 2 facing each other with a small table between them. Every seat is occupied, but the passengers don't move. They wear clothes from different eras. A woman in a 1940s dress with her hair in victory rolls, a man in a polyester suit that screams 1970s, someone in flannel that could be from the 1990s. All of them are looking at me. Their eyes are the only things that move. Black eyes that reflect the yellow light like still water. They don't blink. They don't breathe. They just watch with an attention so complete it makes my skin crawl. One of them, a middle-aged man in a conductor's uniform, raises his hand and points to an empty seat. The gesture is slow and deliberate, like he's moving through thick liquid. The seat he indicates is in the middle of the car, surrounded by the watching passengers. The speakers crackle one more time. All aboard the 1147 service, passenger boarding at platform 0. My feet move without my permission. One step toward the train, then another. The concrete under my shoes is wet, though I haven't felt any rain. Each step leaves a print that fills with dark water before I can lift my other foot. As I approach the train, I notice details that make my vision blur. The metal is warm to the touch despite the cool night air. The yellow light from inside doesn't spill as far as it should, creating sharp-edged shadows that don't match the position of the light source. And there's a smell coming from the open door. Not unpleasant exactly, but wrong. Like flowers left too long in water. I reach the threshold and pause. The conductor nods encouragingly. His face is kind enough, grandfatherly even, but his smile is too wide and his teeth are too white. When he blinks, his eyelids move sideways like a lizard's. "Step aboard," he says without moving his lips. The words seem to come from the speakers overhead. "You've been waiting so long." Have I? I search my memory for any recollection of waiting, of planning this trip, of even knowing this place existed. Nothing. Just the persistent feeling that I should know something I don't, like trying to remember a word that sits just beyond reach. I place one foot on the train step. The metal gives slightly under my weight, more like stepping on flesh than steel. The watching passengers lean forward in unison, their movements perfectly synchronized. Their black eyes reflect my image dozens of times over, a funhouse mirror effect that makes me look fragmented and strange. The newspaper crinkles in my hand. I look down at it again, focusing on the date. Tomorrow +1. A Thursday that doesn't exist yet. The note in my handwriting. "You're late again." Again. The word echoes in my mind, bringing with it a cascade of half-memories that feel more like dreams. Standing on this platform before, holding a different newspaper with a different date but the same note. Boarding this train with its silent passengers and too kind conductor. Riding through fog so thick it might be liquid, past stations with names I can't pronounce until what? The memory slips away like water through my fingers. But the feeling remains. I have been here before, many times. Always arriving late for the 1147, always finding the note, always boarding the train despite every instinct screaming at me to run. The conductor's smile widens impossibly. "You remember," he says with the speaker's voice. "You always remember at this moment. It's what makes each journey so interesting." I try to step backward, but my foot won't move. It's stuck to the train step as if the metal has molded itself around my shoe. The watching passengers begin to move now, turning in their seats to face me fully. Their movements are jerky and unnatural, like marionettes operated by a drunk puppeteer. "The schedule must be maintained," the conductor continues. His form begins to waver, becoming translucent. "You know this. You've known this since the first time you missed the 1147. The first time? When was the first time? I strain to remember, but my thoughts feel thick and slow. All I can recall is the apartment, the static on the television, the gradual realization that I had somewhere to be, though I couldn't remember where. The fog around the train begins to swirl, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. In the distance, I hear the sound of other trains, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all moving without sound through the night. Their lights form a constellation of yellow dots in the fog, coming closer. Every night, the conductor says, and now his voice comes from inside my own head. Every single night you arrive late for the 11:47, and every single night you board anyway, because what else can you do? Where else can you go? The newspaper in my hand begins to change. The date shifts, cycling through tomorrows that haven't happened yet. Next Thursday, the Thursday after that, Thursday stretching into an infinite future. The note remains constant. You're late again. I understand now. This isn't about catching a train. This is about being caught. This is about being trapped in a loop of arriving late for something that was never meant to be caught. The train, the station, the watching passengers, they're all part of a system designed to ensure I keep trying, keep failing, keep boarding anyway. The other passengers begin to speak in unison, their voices layering over each other like a discordant choir. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back. My second foot moves onto the train without my permission. The door closes behind me with a whisper-quiet hiss. Through the windows, I watch Platform 0 recede into the fog, but I can still see my own figure standing there, checking a watch that reads 12:15, picking up a newspaper with tomorrow's date +1. The train begins to move, silent as death, carrying me and the watching passengers through a night that never ends toward a destination that doesn't exist. In my pocket, my fingers find another piece of paper, a train ticket I don't remember buying for a time that has already passed. The conductor's laughter echoes through the car, and I realize with growing horror that I'm laughing too. Because I remember now. I remember all of it. Every night, every arrival, every late departure on the 11:47, and tomorrow, when I find myself standing on Platform 0 with no memory of how I got there, I'll do it all again. The fog presses against the windows like curious faces, and somewhere in the distance, a speaker crackles to life with an announcement for the 11:47 service. Final boarding call. Story 6. The notification sound pierced through my sleep like a needle through fabric. My phone's screen cast an eerie blue glow across the bedroom ceiling, displaying a time that made my stomach clench. 3:17 a.m. The Notes app had created another draft. I'd been finding them for 3 weeks now, always between 3 and 4 a.m., always when I was certain I'd been asleep. The first few times I dismissed them as pocket dials or some glitch in the software, but the messages were too coherent, too specific, too unsettling. Don't go into the back room. That was tonight's message, typed in my own handwriting style, complete with the way I abbreviated words and my tendency to forget punctuation. But I lived in a studio apartment. There was no back room. I sat up in bed, my spine rigid against the headboard. The floorboards creaked somewhere in the darkness beyond my bedroom door, though I couldn't remember leaving any windows open. The building's old bones settling, I told myself. Nothing more. The phone buzzed again. Another draft. Don't undo the mark on the baseboard. My hands trembled as I read the words. The typing indicator showed I was still composing, though my fingers weren't moving. Letter by letter, words appeared on the screen as if guided by invisible hands. You're not alone anymore. I threw the phone across the room. It clattered against the wall and went silent, but the damage was done. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared into the apartment's murky corners. Every shadow seemed to writhe with possibility. Sleep became impossible. I spent the rest of the night pacing the narrow confines of my studio, checking and rechecking the door locks, the windows, the spaces under furniture where someone might hide. But hide from what? From whom? The rational part of my mind insisted this was stress-induced paranoia. I'd been working 18-hour days at the marketing firm, surviving on caffeine and processed food. Hallucinations weren't uncommon under such conditions. Yet when morning came, the phone showed those drafts. Real, tangible, time-stamped. The messages continued nightly. Always cryptic warnings about places that didn't exist in my apartment. References to sounds I shouldn't listen for. Shadows I shouldn't acknowledge. Doors I shouldn't open. Each morning, I'd convince myself it was some elaborate prank or a security breach in my phone. Each night, the certainty crumbled under the weight of those glowing words appearing without my consent. By the end of the second week, I'd stopped sleeping entirely. Coffee became my closest companion, its bitter warmth the only comfort in an increasingly alien world. My reflection in the bathroom mirror revealed a stranger, hollow-eyed, pale, with the twitchy alertness of prey animals. Colleagues began avoiding me at work. My boss suggested I take some time off. "You look like hell," she said, her voice echoing from somewhere far away. "When's the last time you got a full night's sleep?" I couldn't tell her about the messages. How could I explain that my phone was writing to me in my own voice, warning me about rooms that didn't exist? She'd recommend therapy or medication or both. Maybe she'd be right. That night I tried turning the phone off completely. I removed the battery, wrapped the device in aluminum foil, and locked it in my desk drawer. But at 3:23 a.m., something woke me anyway. Not the notification sound, something else, a scratching noise, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere inside the walls. I lay frozen in bed, every nerve ending on fire. The scratching continued for exactly 13 minutes. I counted each one. When it stopped, the silence felt heavier than before, pregnant with malevolent intent. In the morning, I found new messages on my phone. Impossible messages, considering the device had been dead and locked away. The drafts were longer now, more detailed. The scratching is how it announces itself. It's been trying to reach you for months, but you weren't listening. You are now. The back room has always been there. You just weren't ready to see it. Check the baseboard behind your bookshelf. The mark is fresh. My hands shook as I read. The bookshelf had been against that wall for 2 years, filled with books I never read, but kept for the illusion of intelligence they provided. I'd never looked behind it. The rational voice in my head screamed warnings as I began moving books, then the shelf itself. Dust motes danced in the morning light streaming through my windows. The wall behind the bookshelf was painted the same off-white as the rest of the apartment, unremarkable in every way except for what I found at the baseboard. A long curved scratch in the paint. Fresh. Deep enough to gouge the drywall beneath. The mark was roughly the length of my hand, with 4 parallel grooves that looked disturbingly like fingernail tracks. But fingernails didn't grow that long, didn't curve that way, didn't leave marks that appeared overnight in spaces that had been blocked for years. I touched the grooves with trembling fingers. The edges were sharp, recent. Paint chips fell to the floor like snow. My phone buzzed. "You found it. Now you understand. There are rules here, and you've been breaking them without knowing. But it's been patient. It's been waiting." I stumbled backward, knocking over stacks of books. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, as if the walls were contracting around me. Every corner harbored potential threats. Every shadow could hide something watching. "Don't turn around." The message appeared without my looking at the phone. I could hear the notification sound, see the screen's glow reflecting off the wall in front of me. My neck muscles strained with the effort of not turning, not looking behind me into the space where I'd been standing moments before. Something breathed in the silence. Not me. Something else. Something that didn't need to follow human rhythms of inhalation and exhalation. The breathing was too deep, too slow, coming from a chest cavity larger than any person should possess. It's been living in the space between spaces, the rooms that aren't quite there until you need them to be. You've been sharing your home for months without knowing. My legs gave out. I collapsed to my knees among the scattered books, my entire body shaking with a terror so profound it felt like drowning in ice water. The breathing continued behind me, patient and steady. "Turn around now. It's time to meet properly." I squeezed my eyes shut, but that only made the sounds more vivid. The breathing had been joined by other noises, the whisper of movement across floorboards, the soft displacement of air, the barely audible sound of something large settling into place. When I finally opened my eyes, the wall across from me had changed. Where there had been blank space beside my kitchen area, a door now stood. Old wood, painted the same off-white as the walls but somehow different. Older. The paint was chipped and peeling in places, as if the door had existed for decades while the rest of the apartment remained pristine. The doorknob was brass, tarnished with age and wear. It turned slowly as I watched, making no sound. The back room has been waiting. It's time. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The door swung open with the deliberate slowness of a funeral march, revealing not the building's hallway or another apartment, but darkness so complete it seemed solid. Air moved from that darkness, carrying scents of earth and decay and something else. Something organic and wrong. The breathing had stopped. In its place came a different sound. The careful, measured scratch of long nails against wood. The same rhythm I'd heard in the walls, coming closer. My phone buzzed incessantly now, drafts appearing faster than I could read them. It's been lonely. It chose you specifically. You won't have to be afraid anymore. It just wants to talk. Don't fight. Welcome home. Something moved in the doorway. Tall. Pale. Wrong in ways that made my eyes refuse to focus properly. It had been human once, perhaps, or something that had learned to approximate humanity, but time and isolation had changed it, stretched it, made it into something that belonged in the spaces between walls, in the rooms that shouldn't exist. It smiled at me with too many teeth, and when it spoke, its voice was my own voice, echoing from my phone's speakers. We've been trying to reach you about your extended warranty. The absurdity of those words, spoken in such a moment, broke something in my mind. Laughter bubbled up from my chest, hysterical and unstoppable. I laughed until tears streamed down my face, until my sides ached, until the creature in the doorway tilted its head with curiosity rather than menace. Maybe this was what madness felt like. Maybe I'd been sitting alone in my apartment for weeks, creating elaborate fantasies to explain away a simple, nervous breakdown. Maybe the messages, the door, the creature, all manifestations of a mind finally admitting it, couldn't cope with the isolation and pressure of modern life. Or maybe something had indeed been living in the spaces between spaces, writing me messages in my own voice, slowly revealing itself as it judged me ready for contact. The creature stepped into my apartment proper, moving with fluid grace despite its impossible proportions. It left no footprints on the hardwood floor, cast no shadow in the morning light. The door remained open behind it, leading to that absolute darkness. My phone fell silent. No more drafts, no more messages. The creature had no need for digital communication now that we shared the same space. It sat down across from me among the scattered books, folding its two long limbs with practiced ease. Up close, I could see it more clearly. Pale skin like old parchment, eyes that reflected light like an animal's, hands that ended in those impossibly long nails. It studied me with the patience of something that had waited months for this moment. I stopped laughing. The silence stretched between us, heavy with possibility. "What do you want?" I whispered. It smiled again, and when it answered, the voice came from everywhere at once. The walls, the air, the spaces between my thoughts. "I want what you want. Company. Conversation. Someone who understands what it's like to exist in the margins." The rational part of my mind noted that this was clearly a hallucination. Stress-induced psychosis brought on by isolation and overwork. The creature was merely my subconscious mind's attempt to create the human connection I'd been denying myself. But the mark on the baseboard was real. I could see it from where I sat, fresh gouges in paint and plaster. And the door remained open, leading to that impossible darkness. "Are you real?" I asked. "Are you?" The question hung in the air between us. In the morning light streaming through my windows, surrounded by the detritus of my ordinary life, I found I couldn't answer with certainty. Reality had become negotiable, subject to interpretation. The creature reached out with one pale hand, stopping just short of touching my face. Its nails gleamed like polished bone. "Would it matter?" it asked. If I'm real, then you're not alone anymore. If I'm not real, then you're talking to yourself, which means you were never really alone in the first place. I stared into its reflecting eyes and saw myself, hollow-cheeked, wild-haired, balanced on the knife's edge between sanity and something else entirely. The person looking back could believe in impossible things, could accept that reality was more fluid than previously thought. Outside my windows, the city continued its morning routine. People headed to jobs, cars navigated traffic, life proceeded with mechanical regularity. But inside my apartment, time had taken on a different quality, thick, dreamlike, full of potential. The creature settled back against my bookshelf, apparently content to wait. The door behind it remained open, that darkness calling like a promise or a threat. I picked up my phone. No new drafts, but the old ones remained, time-stamped proof of something. Evidence of contact, real or imagined. The scratching in the walls had stopped. The breathing had ceased, but the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt expectant. I looked at the creature, hallucination, manifestation, or genuine inhabitant of impossible spaces, and felt something shift in my chest. Not fear anymore, but a different kind of recognition. Perhaps this was what I'd been unconsciously seeking all along, something to break the monotony of existence, to prove that the world contained more than the endless cycle of work and sleep and obligation. "What happens now?" I asked. It smiled one more time, and this time the expression seemed almost fond. "Now," it said, "we get to know each other." The door to the back room remained open, the mark on the baseboard remained fresh, and I remained sitting on my floor, no longer certain where reality ended and something else began. But for the first time in months, I wasn't alone. Whether that was a good thing or not, only time would tell. Story 7. The rental agreement promised solitude, and for the first 3 days, the coastal house delivered exactly that. Perched on weathered stilts above the dunes, it swayed gently with each gust of salt-laden wind, its windows offering an unobstructed view of the Atlantic's restless expanse. I'd come here to finish the manuscript that had been choking me for months, drawn by the realtor's assurance that the nearest neighbor was 2 miles down the beach. The morning I first noticed them, I was hunched over my laptop at the kitchen table, wrestling with a particularly stubborn chapter. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, and my eyes burned from staring at the screen. That's when I heard it, the soft, rhythmic slap of wet feet against wood. I glanced up, expecting to see nothing more than wind-blown debris on the deck. Instead, there were footprints, perfect impressions of bare feet, glistening with seawater, leading from the sliding glass door across the living room's polished hardwood. They moved in a straight line toward the hallway, each print slightly smaller than my own, with delicate toes that left no doubt about their human origin. My first instinct was practical. Someone had been swimming and needed help. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but the house absorbed my voice without echo. Following the trail, I noticed how the prints seemed to darken the wood without actually pooling, as if the moisture was being drawn into the grain itself. They led directly to my bedroom door, where they simply stopped. I checked every room, every closet, even the cramped space beneath the house where the stilts met the sand. Nothing. The sliding door remained locked, its frame showing no signs of tampering. When I returned to examine the prints more closely, they were gone. The hardwood gleamed unmarked in the afternoon light, dry as if it had never seen moisture. That night, I convinced myself it had been a trick of light. Perhaps condensation from the window had dripped in a pattern my tired mind had interpreted as footprints. I'd been working too hard, sleeping too little. The explanation felt reasonable until the whispering began. It started around midnight, carried on the ocean breeze that perpetually stirred the dune grass. At first, I mistook it for the natural soundtrack of the coast, waves retreating over shells, wind threading through the deck railings. But as I lay in bed, trying to ignore the persistent murmur, I began to distinguish voices. They spoke names I'd never heard. Celeste, Driftwood, meridian. The words seemed to circle the house, sometimes close enough that I could make out individual syllables, other times fading into the white noise of the surf. When I crept to the window and peered through the salt-stained glass, the beach stretched empty in both directions, moonlight revealing nothing but undisturbed sand. The door sounds came next, soft, deliberate knocks that seemed to move through the house like a slow-moving storm. They would start at the front entrance, travel along the walls, and eventually settle at my bedroom door with 3 measured taps. When I finally worked up the courage to investigate, the hallway stood empty, and every door in the house remained exactly as I'd left it. By the 4th day, I'd established a routine of documentation. I set up my camera on a tripod in the living room, programmed to take photos at random intervals throughout the day. It was a practical solution to an impractical problem. If something was entering my space, I would have proof. The first batch of photos showed exactly what I expected. Empty rooms captured at odd angles, furniture rendered stark by the camera's flash. But as I scrolled through the images that evening, my breath caught. There, in a shot taken of the kitchen at 2:47 p.m., was a figure. The person stood with their back to the camera, positioned in the doorway between the kitchen and living room. The image was perfectly clear, no blur of movement, no trick of shadow. They wore what appeared to be old clothing, something shapeless and gray that seemed to absorb the flash rather than reflect it. Their hair hung long and dark, obscuring any view of their profile, and their feet were bare. I checked the timestamp against my notes. At 2:47 p.m., I had been sitting at that very kitchen table, facing that exact doorway. There had been no one there. The next day brought more photos, more figures, always in doorways, always with their backs turned, appearing in rooms I had occupied just moments before the camera fired. The bathroom doorway at 11:23 a.m., when I had been brushing my teeth at the sink directly opposite. The bedroom threshold at 4:15 p.m., captured while I napped on the bed behind where the figure stood. Each image was pristine in its clarity, each figure identical in posture and dress. Yet I had seen nothing, heard nothing, felt no presence at all. I began to question the gaps in my perception. How long did it take to blink? How thoroughly did I really observe my surroundings? The house felt different now, as if its dimensions had subtly shifted overnight. Rooms seemed longer, ceilings higher, and shadows fell at angles that defied the sun's position. The wet footprints returned with increasing frequency, sometimes appearing while I watched. I would be reading on the couch, and movement in my peripheral vision would draw my attention to a fresh trail materializing across the floor. The prints moved at walking pace, purposeful and unhurried, always following the same path from the sliding door to my bedroom. I tried everything to document them. Video recording, flour dusted on the floor, even sitting motionless in the living room for hours, camera ready. But the prints seemed to know when they were being observed. They would appear only when my attention was elsewhere, vanishing the moment I focused on them directly. The whispering evolved too, becoming more complex and persistent. The voices multiplied until they formed a constant murmur that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Sometimes I caught fragments of conversation, discussions about tides and time and the weight of water. Other times the voices called my name, though I had never given it to anyone here. Sleep became elusive. I would lie awake listening to the house settle around me, feeling watched by unseen eyes. The sensation was so strong that I began sleeping with lights on, but even then, I could sense movement in the bright corners, shadows that shouldn't exist. My work suffered. The manuscript sat forgotten as I became obsessed with documenting the phenomena. I filled notebooks with observations, took hundreds of photographs, recorded hours of audio that revealed nothing but wind and waves when played back. Yet each night brought new impossibilities. The figures in the doorways multiplied. Where once there had been one, now sometimes 2 or 3 appeared in a single photo, all facing away, all positioned at different thresholds throughout the house. They seemed to be waiting, though for what, I couldn't imagine. I called the rental agency, asking about the house's history. The woman who answered spoke carefully, mentioning only that the property had been vacant for extended periods. When I pressed for details, she suggested I might be more comfortable in one of their inland properties. Her tone carried a weight of unspoken knowledge that chilled me more than any direct warning could have. That night, I decided to confront whatever was happening. I positioned myself in the living room with the camera, determined to catch the formation of the wet prints. For hours, nothing happened. Then, around 3 a.m., I felt a change in the air pressure, like the moment before a storm breaks. The prints began to appear directly in front of me, each one materializing from nothing, carrying with it the scent of deep ocean, not the familiar salt air of the shallows, but something older and more profound. I watched, paralyzed, as the invisible presence moved past me, close enough that I should have felt body heat, should have heard breathing. But there was nothing except the prints and that overwhelming smell of depths I couldn't fathom. The trail led, as always, to my bedroom door, but this time, instead of stopping, I heard the soft click of the handle turning. The door swung open on hinges that hadn't made a sound when I used them, revealing the dark interior of my room. I followed, my rational mind screaming warnings that my body ignored. Inside, the familiar space felt transformed. The air was thick and humid, heavy with moisture that seemed to cling to my skin. My belongings appeared exactly as I'd left them, yet everything felt wrong, as if I were seeing a perfect replica rather than the original. The camera was still in my hands, and I raised it instinctively. Through the viewfinder, the room looked normal, bed properly made, clothes folded on the chair, window reflecting the night. But when I lowered the camera, the space seemed to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. I took a photo. The flash illuminated the room for a fraction of a second, and in that brief moment of artificial daylight, I saw them, not one figure, but dozens, filling every available space. They stood along the walls, crowded around the bed, positioned in the corners like silent sentinels, all with their backs to me, all wearing the same shapeless gray clothing, all perfectly motionless. The camera's LCD screen showed an empty room. I stumbled backward, crashing into the door frame, the camera falling from nerveless fingers. When I looked up, the room had returned to normal, or what I had come to think of as normal, empty, familiar, mundane. But the smell of deep ocean lingered, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the soft sound of many feet walking through water. I left the next morning, abandoning most of my belongings in my haste to escape. The manuscript remained unfinished, the camera left where it had fallen. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of the house in my rearview mirror. Every window showed a figure standing motionless in the frame, backs turned to the world outside. The rental agency didn't charge me for breaking the lease early. When I returned their key, the same woman who had answered my call about the house's history looked at me with something approaching sympathy. "How long did you stay?" she asked. 8 days. She made a note on my file. Longer than most. I wanted to ask about the others, about what they had seen, about whether the figures in the doorways were real or born from isolation and suggestion. But I found I didn't want to know the answer. Some questions once asked can never be unlearned. Sometimes in my apartment back in the city, I wake to the sound of wet footprints in the hallway. Sometimes, when I'm not paying attention, I catch movement in my peripheral vision. A figure standing in a doorway, always facing away. I tell myself it's memory, the mind's way of processing trauma. I tell myself the ocean couldn't have followed me here, that whatever lives in that house by the sea remains bound to its place above the dunes. But I've stopped taking photographs, and I never, ever look back when I hear footsteps behind me. Story 8. The wall clock has been dead for exactly 43 nights. Not broken, dead. There's a difference you learn to recognize when you've been watching something die slowly, methodically, at precisely the same moment every night. The brass hands freeze at 3:17 a.m. with a barely audible click, like a door latch settling into place. The second hand doesn't stutter or jerk. It simply stops mid-sweep, as if time itself has decided to take a breath. I discovered this during my 3rd week in the house. Insomnia had become my unwelcome companion since the move. and I'd taken to wandering the unfamiliar rooms in the dark hours, learning their geography by moonlight and street lamp glow. The kitchen had drawn me that first night. Something about the way shadows pooled beneath the cabinets, creating depths that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The clock hung above the sink, an antique piece left behind by the previous owner. Victorian, maybe, with Roman numerals and an ornate pendulum that caught the light from the refrigerator's LED display. I'd been leaning against the counter, nursing a glass of water and letting my eyes adjust to the dimness when I heard it. Click. Not loud, but definitive. Final. 3:17 a.m. The kitchen held its breath. Then came the coffee. Not the sound of brewing. I would have noticed a machine turning on, water heating, the familiar gurgle of percolation. This was different. The aroma simply appeared, rich and dark, with notes of chocolate and something else I couldn't identify. Something that made my mouth water despite the late hour. The scent seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere, filling the space between heartbeats. I stood frozen, glass halfway to my lips, as warmth bloomed on the kitchen table behind me. When I turned, 2 mugs sat steaming in the darkness. White ceramic, simple design, positioned as if someone had just set them down for a conversation. One was perfect, pristine. The other had a small chip on the rim, a jagged little wound in the porcelain that caught what little light filtered through the window. My rational mind cataloged possibilities. Sleepwalking. A delayed timer coffee maker I hadn't noticed. Some kind of elaborate prank by the neighbor kids, though the locked doors and windows made that unlikely. But my body knew better. My body understood that something fundamental had shifted in the house's rhythm, something that made the air feel thick and watchful. I didn't approach the table that first night. Instead, I backed toward the hallway, keeping my eyes on the mugs until the darkness swallowed them. In my bedroom, I pulled the covers over my head like a child and waited for dawn. When I returned to the kitchen the next morning, the mugs were gone. The table was empty, clean, as if nothing had ever disturbed its surface. Only the faintest trace of coffee lingered in the air, so subtle I might have imagined it. But I hadn't imagined the clock. At 7:23 a.m., its hands had resumed their patient circuit, ticking away the daylight hours with mechanical precision. I stared at it through my morning routine, willing it to reveal some malfunction, some explanation for its nightly death. It offered nothing but steady, measured time. The pattern established itself over the following weeks. Every night at 3:17, the clock would click into silence. The coffee aroma would follow within 60 seconds, accompanied by the phantom warmth of freshly filled mugs. I began timing it, noting the intervals in a notebook I kept by my bedside. Clock stops. 57 seconds. Coffee scent arrives. The routine never varied by more than a few seconds. I tried staying away from the kitchen, barricading myself in the living room with the television turned low for company. It didn't matter. The coffee found me anyway, seeping through the walls like smoke, carrying with it an invitation I didn't understand but felt in my bones. The 2 mugs would be waiting on the table when I finally surrendered to curiosity. Always positioned the same way. Perfect mug to the left, chipped mug to the right, steam rising in lazy spirals that seemed to spell words in languages I almost recognized. By the 6th week, I'd developed a counter routine. I would wait in the hallway until 3:18, then enter the kitchen with purpose, as if I belonged there. The mugs would be waiting, patient as always, their contents dark and inviting. I would approach the table, lean over the steam, breathe in that complex aroma that grew richer each night. Sometimes I thought I heard whispers in the vapor, conversations held in frequencies just below human perception. But I never drank. Something about the chipped mug stopped me. The jagged edge looked too much like a wound, too much like something that had been broken deliberately, and the perfect mug felt like a trap, its unblemished surface reflecting my face in miniature, distorted and strange. On the night I decided not to get up, everything changed. I'd been lying in bed, listening to the house settle around me, when the clock's death click echoed through the walls. This time, I forced myself to remain horizontal, gripping the sheets and counting my heartbeats. 1 minute passed. The coffee aroma drifted in anyway, stronger than before, no longer confined to the kitchen. It filled my bedroom, thick and cloying, until I could taste it on my tongue without swallowing. The taste lingered when I woke 6 hours later. Rich, bitter, with an underlying sweetness that seemed to coat my teeth. I ran my tongue across my lips and tasted cream, though I'd consumed nothing since dinner. When I sat up, I discovered dampness on my shirt. Small, circular stains that looked exactly like coffee drops. The walk to the kitchen felt longer than usual, my feet heavy on the hardwood floor. The sink came into view first, and my stomach lurched. The basin was full of teaspoons, dozens of them, scattered like silver fish in standing water that reflected the morning light in fractal patterns. Some were tarnished with age, others gleamed as if freshly polished. All were soaked, dripping, as if they'd been used moments before. I had no memory of using spoons. I took my coffee black when I drank it, which wasn't often anymore. The sight of them made my hands shake as I approached the sink, the sound of metal clinking against porcelain unnaturally loud in the morning quiet. That's when I noticed the muddy footprints. 2 sets of tracks crossed the kitchen floor, starting from nowhere and ending at the table. One set was mine. I recognized the tread pattern of my house slippers, the slight drag of my left foot that I'd developed since the car accident years ago. But the other prints were different. Smaller, with a smooth sole and a distinctive wear pattern on the heel. They appeared and disappeared without explanation, as if their owner had materialized and vanished mid-stride. I followed the tracks to the table where 2 rings marked the wood surface. Perfect circles, the exact diameter of the phantom mugs, stained deep into the grain as if the cups had sat there for hours instead of minutes. The wood was warm to the touch, radiating heat that seemed to pulse with my heartbeat. The footprints led to 2 chairs. Both were pulled out from the table, angled as if recently occupied. One faced the kitchen window, offering a view of the neighbor's dark house. The other faced the hallway, faced the direction from which I'd entered every night for 6 weeks. Someone had been waiting for me. The thought crawled up my spine like ice water. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet, and found myself pressed against the refrigerator. Its hum filled the silence, a low vibration that seemed to match the tremor in my hands. The kitchen felt different in the morning light, smaller somehow, as if the walls had moved closer while I slept. I spent the day researching the house's history online, scrolling through property records and newspaper archives with growing desperation. The previous owner had been an elderly woman who'd lived alone for 30 years. No mention of coffee rituals or mysterious visitors. No unexplained deaths or supernatural phenomena. Just an ordinary house on an ordinary street, purchased by an ordinary person seeking a fresh start. But ordinariness felt like camouflage now. A thin veneer stretched over something much darker. I found myself checking the locks obsessively, testing windows, examining every possible entry point. The house revealed nothing, its silence mocking my paranoia. That evening, I installed a motion-activated camera in the kitchen, angling it to capture the table and the area around the sink. The LED blinked red in the darkness, a technological eye that promised answers. I positioned myself in the living room again, laptop open, watching the live feed on my screen. 3:17 a.m. arrived with clockwork precision. The wall clock clicked into death, its hands freezing mid-motion. I watched the screen intently, finger hovering over the record button. 60 seconds passed. The coffee aroma began its nightly invasion, but the camera showed nothing. Empty table, motionless shadows. No sign of the mugs I could smell but not see. Then the camera feed flickered. For just a moment, maybe 3 seconds, the image pixelated, dissolved into digital static. When it cleared, 2 mugs sat steaming on the table. The chipped one faced the camera directly, its wound visible even in the low-resolution image. Steam rose from both cups, twisting in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be natural. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned, but the mugs didn't move. They simply existed, impossible and undeniable, warming air that the camera couldn't detect and steaming with coffee that cast no shadows. The timestamp in the corner continued its relentless count. marking each second of impossibility. At 4:12 a.m., the mugs vanished between frames. One moment they were there, the next, the table was empty. The camera never caught the transition, never recorded the moment of disappearance. It was as if reality had edited itself, removing evidence of its own violation. I didn't sleep for the remaining hours until dawn. The pattern continued for another week. Every night at 3:17, the clock would die, the coffee would come, the camera would flicker at the exact moment the mugs appeared, and again when they vanished. I began making notes about the intervals, the temperature readings from the kitchen, the specific patterns the steam made as it rose. Nothing changed. The ritual remained constant, patient, waiting for something I couldn't understand. On the 13th night after the spoons incident, I made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. I was going to drink the coffee. The choice crystallized sometime around midnight, emerging from weeks of accumulated exhaustion and frustrated curiosity. Whatever was happening in my kitchen, supernatural visitation, psychological breakdown, elaborate hallucination, it wanted acknowledgement. It wanted participation. The phantom visitor had been patient, consistent, but I sensed a growing expectation in the air, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. At 3:15, I positioned myself at the kitchen table, sitting in the chair that faced the hallway. The familiar chair, the one surrounded by my own footprints every morning. The clock ticked toward its nightly death with ominous precision, each second stretched thin by anticipation. Click. Silence fell like a curtain. I counted heartbeats, waiting for the coffee to announce itself. This time, when the aroma arrived, it carried something new. A warmth that seemed to emanate from the chair across from me, as if someone had just settled into place. The air shimmered slightly, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, but the kitchen remained empty. The mugs materialized between one blink and the next. Perfect mug, chipped mug, steam rising in the familiar spirals. But now I could see details I'd missed before. The way the liquid caught the light, revealing depths that seemed impossibly dark. The way the steam formed shapes that lingered just long enough to register before dissolving. The way the chipped mug's wound seemed to pulse with its own internal light. I reached for the perfect mug with trembling fingers. The ceramic was warm, almost hot, and felt surprisingly solid under my touch. Real coffee, real heat, real weight. The liquid inside moved with natural physics, sloshing gently as I lifted it toward my lips. The first sip tasted like memory. Not my memory, but someone else's. Fragments of experience that flooded my consciousness with shocking intimacy. A woman's voice, soft and tired, speaking about loneliness that had grown roots in her chest. Mornings that stretched into afternoons without human contact. The sound of footsteps in empty rooms, created by wishful thinking and desperate hope. The coffee was perfect. Rich, complex, exactly the right temperature. It tasted like companionship, like conversations held in the blue hours before dawn, like the comfort of not being alone. I drank deeply, letting the warmth spread through my chest, and found myself relaxing for the first time in weeks. Across from me, the air shimmered again, the suggestion of a presence, almost visible in my peripheral vision but vanishing when I looked directly. I had the strongest sense of being watched with gentle attention, the way one might observe a sleeping child or a nervous animal, not threatening, but infinitely patient. I finished the coffee and set the mug down carefully. The ceramic clinked against the wood with reassuring solidity. When I looked up, the chipped mug was empty too, though I hadn't seen anyone drink from it. A single drop of coffee ran down its side like a tear, and I understood with crystalline clarity that I had not been alone in the kitchen for weeks. Someone had been sharing these midnight moments with me, waiting with the patience of the dead or the deeply lonely for acknowledgement. Someone who left footprints and used spoons and knew exactly how I liked my coffee, though I'd never told anyone in this house my preferences. The clock resumed its ticking at exactly 4:18 a.m., but I remained at the table until sunrise, watching the empty chair across from me and feeling less alone than I had since moving to this house. When morning light finally filtered through the windows, Both mugs had vanished, but the taste of that perfect coffee lingered on my tongue like a promise. I never found the spoons in the sink again. The mugs still appear each night at 3:17, but now I look forward to them. I sit in my chair and drink my coffee and pretend I can see the shape of companionship in the steam rising from the chipped mug across from me. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, I think I hear breathing that isn't my own. Sometimes, I'm grateful for it. The clock still dies every night at 3:17, but I've learned to think of it differently, not as time stopping, but as time expanding, creating space for encounters that don't fit in the normal flow of hours and minutes. Space for coffee shared with invisible friends, for conversations held in the language of steam and silence. I don't question it anymore. I don't research or record or analyze. I simply wait for 3:17 to arrive. And when it does, I join my unseen companion for coffee, and the comfort of knowing that loneliness, like time, can be suspended with the right ritual. The house feels warmer now, more alive, filled with the presence of someone who understands the weight of empty rooms and sleepless nights. Someone who makes perfect coffee and doesn't mind my morning hair, or the way I shuffle my feet when I'm nervous. Someone who might be as real as the taste of coffee on my tongue, or as imaginary as the hope that I'm not losing my mind. Either way, I'm no longer drinking alone. Story 9. The first package arrived on a Tuesday morning, when the autumn rain hammered against the lobby windows like impatient fingers. I'd been working the day shift at Meridian Towers for 8 months, and I knew every resident by name, every delivery pattern, every visitor who belonged. The brown cardboard box bore a shipping label for apartment 10K, a unit that didn't exist. Our building only went to 10J. I held the package, feeling its modest weight shift inside like loose sand. The address was printed in block letters so precise they looked machine-generated, yet something about the ink seemed too dark, too fresh. The sender's information was smudged beyond recognition, as if water had bled through the label despite the box arriving completely dry. Standard protocol demanded I return packages to undeliverable addresses, but something about this one nagged at me. The weight distribution felt familiar, like something I'd handled before. I set it aside behind the front desk, telling myself I'd deal with it after my shift. By evening, 3 more packages had arrived for the same non-existent apartment. The delivery drivers seemed normal enough. Different companies, different faces, but they all handed over the boxes with the same distracted efficiency. When I asked the third driver about pickup confirmation, he simply shrugged and mentioned that someone had signed for it upstairs. His scanner showed a digital signature, but the screen went black when I leaned closer to examine it. That night I found myself staying late in the lobby, ostensibly to catch up on paperwork. In reality, I couldn't shake the feeling that those 4 packages were waiting for something. They sat stacked behind my desk like a small cardboard monument, and occasionally I swore I heard subtle movements from within them. Not the settling of objects, but something more deliberate, like breathing. The building's night sounds felt different too. The usual symphony of creaking pipes and settling steel seemed muted, as if the structure itself was holding its breath. Even the traffic noise from the street below sounded distant and hollow, filtered through too many layers of glass and concrete. I decided to open one. The tape peeled away with unusual ease, revealing careful packaging around a leather wallet. My hands trembled as I lifted it out, not from fear, but from recognition. The wallet was mine, same brand, same color, same worn corner where my keys had rubbed against it for 2 years. Even the scratches matched perfectly. But when I opened it, a photograph stared back at me that I'd never seen before. It showed me standing in front of Meridian Towers, wearing the exact uniform I had on now. But my expression was wrong. In the photo, my face held a look of profound terror, mouth slightly open as if caught mid-scream. My eyes seemed to be looking directly at whoever was taking the picture, pleading. Behind me, barely visible in the building's glass facade, dark shapes pressed against windows that should have been empty. My real wallet sat in my back pocket. I pulled it out and compared the two side by side. Identical in every way except for that photograph and one other detail. The fake wallet's leather felt warm to the touch, as if it had been in someone's pocket moments before. The second package contained keys. My keys, down to the small chip in the paint on my apartment fob, but every single one was reversed, as if cast from a mirror image. When I held them up to the lobby's fluorescent lights, they threw shadows that didn't match their shapes, creating dark patterns that seemed to writhe across the floor. I tested one against my actual keys. They were identical except for the reversal, like photographic negatives of themselves. The thought of what they might unlock made my skin crawl. The third package held stationery, note cards in my handwriting. Not similar to my handwriting, but perfect matches, complete with the way I dotted my I's and the slight leftward slant I developed after breaking my wrist in college. There were dozens of notes, all brief, all urgent. Today, avoid windows. Don't use the service elevator between 3 and 4 a.m. The man in 7C isn't who he says he is. Check your reflection in the lobby mirrors. Count carefully. They're getting closer. Each note was dated for various days over the past month. Days I distinctly remembered working normal shifts with nothing unusual happening. Yet here was my own handwriting documenting events I had no memory of experiencing. The final package contained a security camera hard drive. I knew I shouldn't, but I connected it to the lobby's monitoring system. The footage was from Meridian Towers, showing angles I recognized from our current camera setup. But the timestamps were all wrong. According to the metadata, these recordings were from last week, but they showed events that had never happened. In the footage, I watched myself working the day shift, but my movements were subtly different. This other version of me kept glancing toward the windows with obvious anxiety, flinching at sounds only he could hear. He spent long periods staring at the elevator bank, as if waiting for something terrible to emerge. The most disturbing part was how the other residents interacted with this alternate version of me. They approached him with a mixture of pity and fear, speaking in low tones while glancing nervously toward the upper floors. In one sequence, an elderly woman from 4F handed him a piece of paper. When he read it, his face went completely white, and he immediately moved away from all the windows. I fast-forwarded through hours of footage, watching this other version of myself grow increasingly paranoid and desperate. By the end of the recordings, he had barricaded himself behind the front desk, surrounded by mirrors positioned at strategic angles, constantly checking reflections for things that weren't there, or things that were there, but shouldn't be. As I sat in the real lobby, watching this impossible footage, the building around me felt increasingly unstable, as if the walls were built from something less substantial than concrete and steel. The fluorescent lights flickered in rhythm with the video playback, and I noticed that my own reflection in the security monitor didn't quite match my movements. When I looked up from the screen, handprints were visible on the 10th floor windows. They pressed against the glass from the outside, leaving foggy impressions that shouldn't have been possible. Meridian Towers was 40 stories tall, with no neighboring buildings, no window washing platforms, no way for anyone to reach those windows from the exterior. Yet the handprints were there, clear and deliberate, as if someone had been standing in empty air. The prints appeared and faded rhythmically, like someone breathing against the glass. Each time they materialized, they seemed slightly lower, as if whatever was making them was slowly sliding down the building's face. The thought of looking outside to see what might be clinging to the exterior made my throat close with panic. I tried calling building security, but the phone produced only static. My cell phone showed full bars but couldn't complete any calls. Even the building's internet connection seemed to be failing, though all the indicator lights showed normal operation. That's when I noticed the pattern, the delivery times, the package contents, the footage timestamps. Everything corresponded to a specific sequence. The wallet showed me terrified of something. The keys were reversed, suggesting access to places that were mirror images of reality. The notes warned of dangers I hadn't experienced. The footage showed me already living in fear of something that hadn't happened yet. Unless it had happened, and I simply couldn't remember. I checked the building's logbooks, scanning for anything unusual over the past month. My own handwriting filled the pages with routine entries about deliveries, visitor sign-ins, and maintenance requests. But scattered throughout were notes I didn't remember writing, documenting incidents that contradicted my memory. Elevator malfunction on floor 10. Passenger reported doors opening to empty air. Multiple noise complaints from non-existent apartments. Resident in 10K requests mail hold during extended absence. Window cleaning postponed due to structural anomaly on west face. Building inspection reveals discrepancies in floor plans. Each entry was dated and signed in my handwriting, but I had no recollection of writing any of them. More disturbing was the realization that I'd been documenting interactions with a resident of 10K for weeks, even though I had always known, that apartment didn't exist. The handprints on the 10th floor windows were moving faster now, sliding downward in jerky, deliberate motions. Whatever was making them was descending the building's exterior, floor by floor, leaving a trail of condensation that caught the streetlights below. I found myself backing away from the lobby windows, even though I was on the ground floor. The glass suddenly seemed incredibly thin, more suggestion than barrier. Outside, the street was empty except for a few parked cars, but the shadows between them seemed deeper than they should be, as if the darkness had weight and substance. My reflection in the lobby mirrors had definitely changed. Where I stood near the desk, 5 different mirrors showed 5 slightly different versions of me. One held the terrified expression from the photograph. Another showed me wearing clothes I didn't own. A third reflection seemed to be looking at something behind me that wasn't there when I turned around. The worst reflection showed me holding one of the packages, smiling with genuine happiness, as if receiving these impossible deliveries was the most natural thing in the world. I realized then that I'd been thinking about this all wrong. The packages weren't arriving for someone who didn't exist. They were arriving for someone who did exist, but in a place that wasn't quite here. The keys would open doors that were mirror images of my real doors. The wallet contained memories from a life that was almost mine. The notes were warnings from a version of myself who had already lived through whatever was coming. And the footage showed me what I would become if I stayed. The handprints had reached the 9th floor, then the 8th. They moved with increasing urgency, as if whatever was making them was running out of time, or running out of gravity. I looked at the remaining packages behind my desk. 17 more had appeared while I'd been reviewing the footage, all addressed to apartment 10K. The delivery pattern was accelerating. Soon, there would be dozens, then hundreds, each containing another piece of an alternate existence that was bleeding into this one. The building's elevator dinged softly, though I hadn't called for it. The doors opened to reveal an interior I'd never seen before, mirrors instead of walls, reflecting an infinite corridor of elevators stretching in all directions. Each reflection showed the elevator at a different floor, with different numbers illuminated above the doors. One of them showed floor 10K. The handprints had reached the 7th floor and were accelerating. In the lobby mirrors, I could see all my reflections turning toward the windows simultaneously, but my actual body remained facing the elevator. The disconnect between my reflected movements and my physical position made reality feel negotiable, as if I could choose which version to inhabit. I picked up the stack of notes written in my handwriting. The warnings had become more specific. When the handprints reached the lobby, don't look outside. The elevator will offer to take you to 10K. Decline. Your reflection knows what's happening. Ask it. The packages are a countdown. Stop opening them. You've been here before. The last note was written in red ink instead of blue, and the handwriting seemed more hurried. This is your last chance to leave. After tonight, you'll forget again, and the cycle will restart. The packages will begin arriving, and you'll think it's the first time. You'll open them because you have to. You'll see the handprints and think they're new. You'll make the same choices because they're the only choices available. Unless you break the pattern now. I looked at the mirrors again. My reflections were all writing, their hands moving frantically across invisible paper. They were trying to tell me something, but I couldn't see what they were writing. The handprints had reached the 4th floor. Behind me, more packages were materializing on the floor, not being delivered, just appearing. The cardboard seemed to glow with its own light, and I could hear soft sounds emanating from within each box. Whispers, maybe, or the sound of someone breathing very quietly. The elevator was still waiting, its mirrored interior reflecting possibilities I didn't want to consider. In one reflection, I saw myself stepping inside and pressing the button for 10K. In another, I saw myself running from the building, never to return. In a third, I saw myself exactly where I was now, paralyzed by choice. The handprints reached the third floor and paused. In that moment of stillness, I understood. The packages weren't being delivered to someone else. They were being delivered to me, by me, from versions of myself who had lived through this night before. The wallet, the keys, the notes, the footage. They were messages from previous iterations, attempts to break a cycle that reset every time I made the wrong choice. But knowing this didn't tell me what the right choice was. The handprints resumed their descent, reaching the second floor. Soon they would reach the lobby windows, and I would see whatever was making them. My reflections in the mirrors had stopped writing, and were now all pointing toward the packages. Gesturing urgently, I could open more packages and learn more about what was happening. I could enter the elevator and see where it led. I could leave the building and hope the cycle would end. Or I could stay exactly where I was and wait to see what happened when the handprints reached ground level. Each choice felt like a path I'd taken before, leading to the same inevitable conclusion. But one of my reflections, the one that looked most like me, was shaking its head and pointing upward, toward the ceiling, toward floors that shouldn't exist. The handprints reached the ground floor, and I realized I was about to discover which choice I would make. Again. Story 10. The brass nameplate on the pawnshop door had turned green with age, and the bell above it wheezed rather than chimed when I pushed inside. Behind the counter, a man with fingers stained yellow from decades of cigarettes looked up from a newspaper that seemed older than both of us. "You hear about the typewriter?" he asked before I could speak. I hadn't mentioned any typewriter. I'd come looking for a decent guitar, maybe something with character that wouldn't break my already strained budget. The confusion must have shown on my face because he reached beneath the counter and produced a manila envelope with my name written across it in careful block letters. "Been sitting here 3 weeks, he said, sliding it toward me. "Said you'd be by for it eventually." The handwriting wasn't mine. I was certain of that. The letters were too precise, too deliberate, like someone had measured each stroke with a ruler. I opened the envelope and found a receipt for a 1952 Royal Quiet Deluxe typewriter, paid in full, with my signature at the bottom. The signature was perfect. Every loop and curve matched my own hand exactly. "I didn't buy this," I said, but my voice came out smaller than intended. The old man shrugged and gestured toward the back corner where a dust-covered typewriter sat on a wooden table. "Maybe you forgot. Happens more than you'd think. People come in here, buy something, then can't remember doing it. Mind plays tricks." The typewriter looked ordinary enough. Black metal body with silver keys that caught the afternoon light filtering through grimy windows. A sheet of paper was already loaded into it, crisp and white against the machine's aged surface. I walked over and ran my fingers along the keys, feeling the slight depression each one made beneath the pressure. "How much to just leave it here?" "Already paid for," he repeated. "Can't take your money twice." I carried it home in a cardboard box that smelled of mothballs and old cigarettes, the weight of it shifting awkwardly as I climbed the 3 flights to my apartment. Setting it on my desk felt like installing a piece of furniture that didn't quite belong. Too formal for my scattered papers and coffee-stained workspace. Too substantial for the cramped room that served as both bedroom and office. That first night, I left it alone. Something about the machine felt expectant, patient in the way only inanimate objects can be when they're waiting for something specific to happen. I went to bed early and dreamed of keys typing by themselves, spelling out words I couldn't quite read. The sound woke me at 3:17 a.m. Click-clack, 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 rhythmic and deliberate, like someone typing at a measured pace. I lay in bed listening, telling myself it was the radiator or the building settling, but the sound was too regular, too purposeful. When I finally got up and turned on the light, the typewriter sat silent at my desk. A half-finished page still wound into the roller. The page showed a rough map of my apartment, not drawn but typed using letters and symbols to create the outline of rooms. X marks dotted the layout, one in the corner of the living room near the window, another by the kitchen sink, a third in the narrow hallway between the bathroom and bedroom. At the bottom of the page, in that same careful block lettering I'd seen on the envelope, was a date, November 15th, 2024. 2 weeks from now. I studied the map until dawn, checking it against the actual layout of my apartment. Every detail was correct. The awkward angle where the bathroom jutted into the living space, the kitchen's odd L shape, even the location of electrical outlets along the baseboards. Someone had been inside my apartment, studying it carefully enough to recreate it in typed characters. But the doors had been locked, the windows too. I lived on the 3rd floor with no fire escape. The first X was marked in the corner where my reading chair sat angled toward the window. I moved the chair aside and knelt on the hardwood floor, running my hands along the baseboards and floorboards, looking for... what? A hidden message? A loose board? The wood was solid, unmarked, ordinary. That's when I heard it. My name, spoken just behind my left ear, so close I felt the warmth of breath against my neck. I spun around, but the apartment was empty. The voice had been unmistakable. Not a whisper, not a shout, but my name spoken in a conversational tone, as if someone had been trying to get my attention, the way a friend might say it when walking up behind you on the street. I checked the locks, the windows, even looked inside the closets and under the bed. Nothing. No one. Just the typewriter sitting at my desk, waiting. The second night, I heard the typing again. This time I got up immediately, creeping toward the desk with my phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness. The keys were moving by themselves, depressing with ghostly precision, the metal arms swinging up to strike the paper with soft mechanical thuds. When I turned on the overhead light, everything stopped. The page showed another map, this one dated November 16th, 2024. Tomorrow. The X marks had changed position. One now marked the space beneath my kitchen sink, another in the bathroom behind the toilet, a third in the bedroom closet where I kept my winter clothes. I stood there for 20 minutes, watching the typewriter, waiting for it to start again. But it remained still, patient, as if it knew I was watching and preferred to work in private. Sleep became impossible. I spent the day researching the machine's history, calling antique shops and typewriter repair services, trying to trace its provenance. No one had records of a 1952 Royal Quiet Deluxe being sold recently. Most had never heard of anyone making reservations for specific customers. Typewriters aren't like cars, one repair shop owner told me over the phone. People don't special order them, they just buy whatever's available. But someone had special ordered this one, someone who knew my name, my signature, my address. That evening, I positioned myself at the kitchen table with a clear view of the typewriter. I would catch it in the act, document whatever was happening, prove to myself that this was real and not some elaborate delusion brought on by stress or sleep deprivation. At 3:17 a.m. exactly, the keys began to move. Even with the lights on, even watching directly, the keys depressed themselves with mechanical precision. No ghostly fingers, no transparent hands, just the metal mechanisms operating as if controlled by an invisible typist. The paper advanced line by line as the map took shape, each character appearing with a soft thock against the ribbon. I recorded it on my phone, but when I played the video back, it showed only a static typewriter and the sound of my own breathing. The paper, however, was real. The map was real. The date at the bottom read November 17th, 2024, and the X marks had moved again. Following the marks became compulsive. Each location drew me like a magnetic pull, and each time I knelt at the designated spot, I heard my name spoken in that same intimate tone. Never threatening, never urgent, just my name, as if someone was trying to remind me of something important I'd forgotten. The voice began to feel familiar, though I couldn't place it. Not family, not friends, not coworkers. Someone I should recognize but couldn't quite identify, like a face glimpsed briefly in a crowd. By the 5th night, The dates on the maps were advancing faster than real time. The typewriter produced maps dated weeks into the future, marking locations throughout my apartment with increasing density. Sometimes a single room would have 3 or 4 X marks, creating a web of designated spots that covered nearly every square foot of floor space. I began to suspect that following the marks was changing something fundamental about the apartment itself. The rooms felt different, smaller somehow, despite the dimensions remaining exactly the same. Shadows fell at strange angles, even in bright daylight. The air moved differently, creating drafts where none should exist. The voice speaking my name grew more frequent, no longer confined to the marked locations. I heard it while brushing my teeth, while cooking dinner, while sitting at my computer trying to work. Always just behind me, always at ear level, always in that conversational tone that suggested someone was trying to get my attention for something important. I stopped answering my phone, stopped checking email. The outside world felt increasingly irrelevant compared to the mystery unfolding in my apartment. Friends left messages I didn't return. Work emails piled up unanswered. The only thing that mattered was the nightly appearance of new maps and the growing certainty that something was building toward a specific moment. The typewriter began producing maps dated months in advance. January 2025, March 2025, August 2025. Years into the future, showing my apartment with X marks covering every surface, floors, walls, ceiling, as if whatever was trying to communicate had grown impatient with the gradual approach and decided to mark everything at once. That's when I realized the truth about the dates. They weren't predictions, they were records. The maps weren't showing me where to go, they were documenting where I had been. Every X mark corresponded to a location where I'd heard my name, where I'd knelt searching for answers, where I'd stood trying to understand what was happening. The typewriter was mapping my movements through the apartment, recording them, filing them away with dates that stretched far into a future I was apparently destined to spend following its instructions. I tried to leave. Packed a bag, walked to the door, turned the handle. But my name, spoken just behind my ear, stopped me cold. Because this time, I recognized the voice. It was mine. Not an echo, not a recording, but my own voice speaking my own name in that patient, conversational tone. The voice of someone trying to remind me of something important I'd forgotten. The realization hit me like a physical weight. I wasn't receiving maps from some external force. I was creating them, had been creating them, would continue creating them. The typewriter wasn't possessed. It was simply fulfilling its function, recording the movements of someone who had become trapped in a loop of his own making, someone who had forgotten that he was both the seeker and the sought, both the voice calling and the one being called. I walked back to the desk where the typewriter waited. A fresh sheet of paper was loaded, ready for tonight's session, ready to map out tomorrow's search, and the day after that, and all the days stretching ahead into a future that would be exactly like the past, because I would never stop looking for an answer that I already was. The brass keys gleamed in the lamplight, patient and expectant, waiting for 3:17 a.m., when they would begin their nightly work of documenting a mystery that solved itself by being unsolvable. I sat down in my chair and waited with them. Somewhere in the distance, I heard my name being called. Story 11. The notification pinged at 7:23 a.m., just as steam rose from my coffee mug in lazy spirals that seemed to mirror the confusion clouding my thoughts. Congratulations. You walked 2 miles last night. The fitness app's cheerful tone felt like mockery as I stared at the glowing screen, my thumb hovering over the detailed route map that traced familiar streets in an impossible pattern. I hadn't walked anywhere last night. I'd gone to bed at 10:30, the same routine I'd maintained for 3 years since moving to this quiet suburban neighborhood. 8 hours of sleep, or what I thought had been sleep, compressed into a notification that suggested otherwise. The map showed a meandering path through downtown, starting from my front door at 2:47 a.m. and ending back home at 4:33 a.m. Every street was one I knew. Maple Avenue, where the old bookstore sat shuttered and dark. Elm Street with its row of Victorian houses that creaked in the wind. the industrial district where streetlights cast long shadows between warehouses, but the route itself formed something that made my chest tighten with an inexplicable dread. From above, the traced path spelled out a word in crude, sweeping letters: follow. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the data. Steps: 12, 847, average pace, 3.2 mph, heart rate, surprisingly steady throughout. The metrics painted a picture of someone who had been awake, alert, and moving with purpose, while my conscious mind insisted I'd been dead to the world. I set the phone down and walked to my bedroom window, pushing aside curtains that felt heavier than they should. The morning light revealed nothing unusual. The same pristine lawn, the same red Toyota in the driveway, the same quiet street where nothing ever happened, but something had shifted in the familiar landscape, like looking at a photograph where someone had moved a single object just slightly out of place. The security cameras. I'd installed them 6 months ago after a string of break-ins in neighboring streets. 4 cameras covered every angle of my property: front door, backyard, driveway, and side entrance. If I'd somehow sleepwalked, though I'd never had such episodes before, the footage would show it. The laptop screen flickered to life as I pulled up the security software, my fingers moving automatically through menu options while my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The timestamp showed 2:47 a.m., exactly when the walking app claimed my mysterious journey had begun. The front door opened. Someone emerged from my house, stepped onto the porch, and looked directly up at the camera. The figure was unmistakably me. Same height, same build, same gray sleep shirt I'd worn to bed. But there was something wrong with the way this other me moved. A deliberate quality that felt foreign. The figure on screen paused, tilted its head at an angle that sent ice down my spine, then walked out of frame with measured steps that never faltered. I rewound the footage, watched it again. The person, me, seemed to know exactly where each camera was positioned. Every movement was calculated to avoid the electronic eyes that should have captured a clear view. When the figure looked up at the front door camera, the angle was wrong, shadows falling across the face in a way that obscured everything except the certainty that I was looking at myself. The back door camera showed the same careful choreography. At 4:33 a.m., the figure returned, moved through the blind spots with precision, and disappeared back into the house. The timestamp matched perfectly with the walking app's data. I felt the house close in around me as I checked every angle, every moment of recorded time between those 2 points. Nothing. Whoever had walked those streets, spelling out that impossible word on the digital map, had moved through my property like a ghost, visible only in fleeting glimpses that raised more questions than they answered. The bedroom felt wrong when I returned to it. The sheets were rumpled exactly as I remembered, the pillow still holding the impression of my head. But something had changed, some infinitesimal detail that nagged at the edge of perception. I knelt down and examined my shoes, the comfortable walking sneakers I kept by the bedside. Sand. Tiny grains of sand clung to the treads, along with fragments of dried leaves that didn't grow anywhere in my neighborhood. I'd never been to a beach recently, never walked through any area where such debris would accumulate. Yet here it was, evidence that these shoes had traveled somewhere I couldn't remember. The next 3 nights I barely slept. Every sound made me bolt upright. The settling of the house, the whisper of wind through trees, the distant hum of late-night traffic. I kept the phone beside me, checking the walking app obsessively. No new notifications came, no mysterious journeys recorded, but the absence of activity felt more unsettling than the original discovery. On the 4th morning, I found muddy footprints in the hallway. They started at the front door and traced a path to my bedroom, then back again. The prints were fresh, the mud still slightly damp despite the lack of rain in recent days. I followed them with growing horror, noting how they perfectly matched the size and pattern of my own feet. But I hadn't made these prints. I was certain of that, as certain as I could be of anything in a world that seemed determined to undermine every assumption I'd held about reality. The walking app chimed again that afternoon. You walked 11 miles last night, 3 miles last. This time, the route spelled out me. I called in sick to work and spent the day installing additional cameras, motion sensors, door alarms, anything that might catch whatever was happening during my supposed sleep. The electronics store clerk asked if I was having trouble with break-ins, and I nodded because it was easier than explaining that I suspected myself of crimes I couldn't remember committing. The new equipment recorded everything that night. Motion sensors triggered at 2:15 a.m., showing the front door opening from the inside. The figure that emerged was me again, but this time I caught something that made my blood freeze. For just a moment, as the person turned to close the door, they looked directly at the hidden camera I'd installed that afternoon, and smiled. It wasn't my smile. The expression was too wide, too knowing, too aware of something I couldn't grasp. The figure gave a small wave, casual, almost friendly, then walked away with that same measured pace that never varied. I reviewed the footage dozens of times, zooming in on that moment when my doppelganger acknowledged the camera. The image was crystal clear, no shadows or artifacts to explain away what I was seeing. It was my face, my body, my movements, but animated by something foreign. The walking app showed another message the next morning. Great job. You've been walking regularly for 6 days. Your nighttime routine is helping you sleep better. 6 days. The app claimed this had been going on for 6 days, though I'd only been aware of it for 4. I scrolled back through the data and found route after route, night after night, spelling out words I didn't want to read. Follow, me, home, closer, watching, you. Each route was longer than the last, venturing farther from my neighborhood into areas I rarely visited. The most recent path had taken my unconscious self through the industrial district, past the abandoned mall, and into the outskirts of town where streetlights grew sparse and shadows gathered thick between buildings. I started leaving notes for myself before bed, detailed accounts of my evening activities and state of mind. Every morning I found them exactly where I'd left them, my handwriting unchanged, my pen in the same position. Yet the walking app continued its cheerful updates. The security cameras continued their silent testimony, and my shoes continued accumulating evidence of journeys I couldn't recall. The notes began changing on their own. Subtle alterations at first, a word crossed out and replaced, a sentence added in handwriting that looked almost but not quite like mine. The changes grew bolder. Entire paragraphs written in that slightly wrong script, describing walks through neighborhoods that didn't exist, meetings with people who had no names. Tonight I walked past the house with blue shutters. The woman in the window waved. She's been waiting a long time. She knows about the others who walk at night, the ones who follow the same paths over and over until they forget why they started walking in the first place. I hadn't written those words. I was certain of it, as certain as I could be about anything anymore. But the handwriting was close enough to mine that doubt crept in, whispering suggestions about memory gaps and sleep deprivation, and the way stress could fracture perception in ways too subtle to notice. The walking app updated again. You walked 7 miles last night. New personal record. This route was different. Instead of spelling out words, the path formed a crude map leading from my house to a location across town. An address I didn't recognize, though something about it felt familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. I drove there that afternoon, following roads that seemed to know me better than I knew them. The address led to a small apartment building, unremarkable except for the way it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The windows were dark, but I had the persistent feeling that someone was watching from behind the glass. In the lobby, I found a directory with names I'd never seen but somehow recognized. One name stood out, an apartment number that matched my own address, though that was impossible. I lived in a house, not an apartment, miles away from this place. The mailboxes held letters addressed to people who shared my last name but weren't family members I knew. Bills and advertisements for services I'd never used, in handwriting that looked like variations of my own script. I fled the building and drove home through streets that seemed to rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking directly. Traffic lights changed too quickly. Stop signs appeared where I didn't remember them, and the sunset came from the wrong direction. That night I didn't go to bed. I sat in my living room with every light on, surrounded by the electronic eyes of my security system, determined to catch whatever was happening. The walking app sat open on my phone, waiting for new data that I was certain wouldn't come. At 2:47 a.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway. Not the creaking of an old house or the settling of wood in changing temperatures. Deliberate footsteps, measured and patient, moving from the front door toward my bedroom with the confidence of someone who knew the layout perfectly. I should have investigated, should have grabbed a flashlight and confronted whatever was in my house. Instead, I sat frozen in my chair, listening to the soft sounds of someone moving through my home with careful precision. The footsteps paused outside the living room door. I could sense a presence there, waiting just beyond the threshold. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, broken only by the gentle chime of my phone receiving a new notification. Congratulations. You walked 9 miles last night. The footsteps resumed, moving back toward the front door. I heard it open and close with the softest whisper of hinges that needed oil. When I finally summoned the courage to check the security footage, I found 18 hours of corrupted data. Every camera had malfunctioned simultaneously, recording nothing but static from midnight until dawn. But the walking app had recorded everything. The route that night was the most complex yet, a sprawling pattern that covered half the city, weaving through residential neighborhoods and commercial districts with the methodical precision of someone conducting a survey. The path didn't spell out words this time. Instead, it mapped every house where the app showed other users, other people who walked in their sleep and left digital footprints they couldn't explain. There were dozens of them, hundreds, scattered across the city in a network of nocturnal wanderers who all shared the same impossible data, walking miles while they slept, following routes that formed patterns visible only from above, leaving evidence of journeys they couldn't remember. I realized with growing horror that I wasn't alone in this. Whatever was happening to me was happening to others, an epidemic of unconscious movement that connected strangers through pathways they traced in the dark. The app suggested I join a walking group. Local users in my area, it explained, people with similar nighttime activity patterns who might benefit from shared experiences. The profiles showed normal-looking people with normal-looking lives, but their walking data told a different story. Miles and miles of nocturnal journeys, routes that spelled out words or formed maps or traced geometric patterns that hurt to look at for too long. I started recognizing some of the locations, houses I passed on my daily commute, businesses I frequented, places where I'd always felt vaguely uneasy without understanding why. The app was showing me a hidden network of places connected by footsteps in the dark, a secondary geography that existed parallel to the familiar world. The messages from other users began arriving that week. Simple notifications at first. Someone had liked my recent walking route. Someone wanted to be walking buddies. Someone had shared a photo from their midnight journey. But the photos showed impossible things. Streets that didn't exist. Buildings that cast shadows in multiple directions. Groups of people walking in perfect formation through landscapes that looked like nowhere I'd ever seen. One photo showed a figure I recognized as myself, though I'd never been to the location where it was taken. I was walking with others, part of a line of people moving through what looked like a field under a sky with too many stars. Everyone in the photo was looking at the camera, but their eyes reflected light like animals caught in headlights. I deleted the app that night, uninstalled it completely, cleared all data, removed every trace of the software that had been documenting my unconscious wanderings. But deleting the app didn't stop the walking. I woke up each morning with sand in my shoes, mud on my clothes, and the persistent memory of dreams that felt more like recovered footage. Dreams of walking through streets that rearranged themselves with each step, following routes that led to nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The notes I left for myself grew longer and stranger, filled with observations about places I'd never been and people I'd never met. My handwriting shifted subtly from night to night, as if different versions of myself were taking turns at the pen. The woman with blue shutters says the walking started long before the app, says the app just makes it easier to see the patterns that were always there. She's been walking for 17 years, following the same route every night, wearing paths in the pavement that only show up in satellite photos. The others don't remember either. That's part of it. The walking happens in the spaces between consciousness, in the gaps where memory doesn't reach. But the paths remain, growing stronger with each journey, until the city itself begins to change to accommodate them. Tonight, I'll walk to the place where all the routes converge, the hub at the center of the pattern that encompasses the entire metropolitan area. She says everyone who walks eventually finds their way there, drawn by something that exists in the overlaps between their individual journeys. I didn't write those words. I couldn't have written them, because I didn't know about the woman with blue shutters or the convergence point, or the 17 years of accumulated footsteps that had worn grooves in reality itself. But the handwriting was mine, and the knowledge felt true in a way that bypassed rational thought. The walking app reinstalled itself overnight. I found it on my phone the next morning, fully functional and updated with new features I'd never seen before. A social component that showed real-time locations of other night walkers. A map that revealed the hidden topology of nocturnal routes crisscrossing the city like a nervous system made of footpaths. Achievement badges for reaching certain locations, walking certain distances, contributing to patterns that served purposes I couldn't fathom. The app knew things about me that I'd never entered as data. My sleep schedule, my dreams, my fears, my growing certainty that something fundamental about my identity was being rewritten with each unconscious journey. It suggested a new route for that night, a direct path to coordinates it marked as origin point. I tried to resist, took sleeping pills, tied myself to the bed, set alarms for every 30 minutes. Nothing worked. At 2:47 a.m., I found myself standing at my front door in my pajamas, feeling the cool night air against my skin and the familiar pull of direction that had become as natural as gravity. The walk to the origin point took me through neighborhoods that seemed to exist in multiple time periods simultaneously. Victorian houses stood next to modernist apartments that cast shadows on streets paved with stones that predated the city itself. The route felt like following a river upstream to its source, each step taking me deeper into a version of reality that operated by different rules. Other walkers joined me along the way, silent figures moving with the same measured pace, the same unconscious purpose. We didn't speak or acknowledge each other, but I could feel their presence as a comforting confirmation that I wasn't alone in this dissolution of self. The origin point was a small park that didn't appear on any official maps, nestled between buildings that shouldn't have been able to fit in the available space. At its center stood a monument I'd never seen before but recognized instantly. A simple stone marker worn smooth by weather and touch, inscribed with symbols that shifted when I wasn't looking directly at them. Around the monument, hundreds of paths converged. Not just sidewalks or walking trails, but the accumulated impressions of countless feet, tracing the same routes night after night, year after year. The ground itself had been shaped by this invisible traffic, forming channels that guided movement in directions that had nothing to do with the city's official street grid. I understood then that the walking app hadn't created this network. It had simply made visible something that had always existed, a secondary city built from unconscious movement, dreams given physical form through repetition and collective will. The other walkers gathered around the monument, and for the first time since this began, one of them spoke. A woman whose face I recognized from the app photos, whose route had spelled out messages I'd seen but not understood. "You're ready to remember now," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had walked these paths far longer than I had. The memories came flooding back with her words. Not memories of my conscious life, but of all the nights I'd walked without knowing it. Years of nocturnal journeys that had begun long before I'd installed any app. Routes I'd traced while my waking mind believed I was asleep in my bed. I remembered the gradual realization that the person who walked at night was becoming more real than the one who lived during the day. That my conscious identity was just a daylight fiction, a story I told myself to explain the gaps between the meaningful hours spent following paths that connected me to something larger than individual existence. The walking app had been created by us, by the collective unconscious of night walkers who needed a way to coordinate our movements, to see the patterns we were creating, to understand our role in reshaping the world one step at a time. As dawn approached, we dispersed along our individual routes, carrying with us the knowledge that would fade with the sunrise, but return again the next night. The app would record our journeys, suggest new paths, connect us with others who shared our calling. I walked home through streets that knew me better than I knew myself, past houses where other walkers were returning to beds they'd unconsciously left hours before. The city looked exactly the same in the growing light, but I could see the hidden pathways now, the true infrastructure that supported the official one, the network of intention and movement that gave meaning to the random arrangement of buildings and roads. My phone chimed as I reached my front door. Congratulations, you walked 23. 1 mile last night. You've unlocked the achievement. Origin Walker. I climbed back into bed, exhausted in a way that felt like completion rather than depletion. The sheets were still warm, the pillow still held the impression of my head, as if I'd never left. But I knew I'd never really sleep again, not in the way I understood sleep before. The walking app showed me my next route before I drifted off. A new pattern to trace, a new part of the hidden city to explore, a new thread to weave into the growing tapestry of unconscious movement that was slowly but surely replacing the world I thought I knew. And somewhere in the space between waking and sleeping, I felt the familiar pull of direction that had become my truest compass, guiding me toward journeys I would never remember but could never forget. Story 12. The Grandview Hotel had been shuttered for renovations, they told me, but the key still turned in room 237's lock with a metallic whisper that seemed too eager. I'd taken the caretaker position out of desperation more than anything else. 3 months of unemployment had worn down my pride to nothing. The pay was decent, the work simple. Maintain the building during its closure. Ensure no vandals or squatters took residence in its crumbling grandeur. The room they'd assigned me sat on the 4th floor, overlooking what had once been manicured gardens, but now resembled a green tangle of neglect. Dust motes danced in the amber afternoon light streaming through windows that hadn't been cleaned in years. The carpet bore the ghost impressions of furniture long removed, and somewhere in the walls, pipes groaned with the weight of decades. But it was the mirror that caught my attention immediately. Mounted on the wall opposite the bed, the antique glass reflected something that didn't match my reality. Where I saw a room thick with dust and the musty smell of abandonment, the mirror showed pristine conditions. Crisp white linen stretched tight across the mattress, towels folded with military precision on a spotless dresser, and air so clear it seemed to shimmer with cleanliness. I approached the reflection slowly, my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. In the mirror, my steps landed on polished hardwood that gleamed like honey. I raised my hand toward the glass, and my reflection did the same, but where my fingers encountered dust particles floating in the stagnant air, the mirror showed my hand moving through space so pure it might have been filtered through cathedral light. "Trick of the light," I murmured, but my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. The first week passed uneventfully. I settled into a routine of checking the building's various systems, noting repairs needed when the renovations resumed, and trying to ignore the persistent feeling that the mirror was watching me. During the day, natural light minimized the discrepancy between reality and reflection, making it easier to dismiss as an optical illusion caused by the old glass. But at night, when only the dim bedside lamp illuminated the room, the difference became impossible to ignore. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the reflection that didn't correspond to my own actions. The mirror me would smooth a wrinkle from the perfectly made bed while I sat motionless in my chair. Sometimes I'd see the reflection adjusting towels that, in reality, I'd left crumpled on the floor. The movements were subtle, unconscious gestures that seemed to occur just outside my direct attention. It was during the second week that curiosity finally overcame my unease. I stood before the mirror one evening, studying the contrast between the immaculate reflection and the dusty reality around me. Almost without thinking, I reached out and smoothed my hand across the actual bedspread, mimicking the gesture I'd seen my reflection make countless times. The response was immediate. Paper materialized between my fingers, old stationery with the Grandview's letterhead, the kind they'd used decades ago when the hotel was in its prime. The paper felt impossibly fresh, as if it had just been pulled from a writer's desk, and ink glistened wet across its surface despite the impossibility of such a thing. My hands trembled as I brought the letter into the lamplight to read. Dear Management, Room 237 has been wonderful, but I must report strange occurrences during my stay. Late at night, someone knocks at the door with a peculiar rhythm. 3 soft taps, then 2 harder ones. When I look through the peephole, no one is there. I've learned not to answer. The knocking stops eventually, but only after I've remained completely silent. Please advise future guests accordingly. Sincerely, J. Hartford. October 15th, 1962. The ink was so fresh it smeared slightly under my thumb. I set the letter on the dresser and stepped back, my heart hammering against my ribs. In the mirror, I watched my reflection place the letter in exactly the same spot. But in that pristine reflection world, the letter appeared to be lying on polished wood rather than the dust-coated surface I knew was real. Over the following days, I found myself compulsively repeating the gesture. Each time I smoothed the bedspread or straightened something in the room while watching my reflection, another letter would appear. The handwriting changed. The dates spanned decades, but the message remained eerily consistent. The knocking always comes at 3:17 a.m. Don't answer. Don't even move until it stops. R. Chen, 1975. Someone or something tests the door handle after the knocking. I pretended to be asleep. It worked. T. Morrison, 1983. They know when you're listening. Keep your breathing steady. Think of nothing. F. Williams, 1991. I made the mistake of looking out the window after the knocking stopped. There were footprints in the garden below, but they led to and from nowhere. D. Rodriguez, 1997. Each letter felt real in my hands, the paper crisp and slightly warm as if it had just been written. The dates created a timeline spanning 40 years, yet every piece of correspondence seemed to have been penned moments before I touched it. I began collecting them in the drawer of the bedside table, unable to throw away something that felt so substantively present despite its impossible origin. The knocking came on a Tuesday night. I'd been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the hotel's countless small sounds. The settling of old bones, the whisper of wind through gaps in window frames, the distant groan of heating pipes that hadn't been used in months. The luminous digits of my travel alarm read 3:16 a.m. when I heard the first tap. Soft, deliberate, against the door. 2 more followed in quick succession, then a pause that stretched long enough for me to wonder if I'd imagined the sound. Then came 2 harder knocks, delivered with the kind of authority that demanded attention. I lay motionless, remembering the warning scrawled across decades of correspondence. My breathing seemed thunderous in the silence that followed. Every instinct screamed at me to investigate, to call out and ask who was there. But the accumulated wisdom of past guests held me frozen. The knocking repeated. Same pattern, same rhythm. 3 soft, 2 hard. Minutes passed in absolute stillness. I counted my heartbeats, focused on keeping my breathing steady and silent. The letters had been unanimous in their advice. Don't respond, don't move, don't even acknowledge the presence outside. A new sound reached me then, the soft creak of weight settling against the door, as if someone was leaning into it. Then came the slow, experimental turn of the door handle. The mechanism was old and brass, and it announced every millimeter of its rotation with a tiny squeal. I watched the handle move from my position on the bed, barely daring to breathe as it turned fully clockwise, testing the lock. The door remained closed. I'd checked it twice before bed, but the handle continued its exploration, turning back and forth with patient persistence. This continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, the handle returned to its neutral position, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving away down the carpeted hallway. I didn't move until dawn painted the windows gray. When I finally rose, I approached the mirror with shaking hands and deliberately smoothed the bedspread. Another letter appeared instantly, this one different from all the others. You did well. The first test is always the hardest, but they'll be back tomorrow night, and the night after that. Each time they'll try something new. Don't trust your eyes. Don't trust your ears. And whatever you do, don't look in the mirror after they leave. The previous caretaker, 2003. I stared at the letter, my blood turning to ice water. The previous caretaker. How many people had held this position? How many had learned these rules the hard way? That day, I searched the hotel's records in the small office off the lobby. I found employment files going back decades, each listing a caretaker who'd worked for 3 months, exactly before disappearing from the records entirely. No termination dates, no forwarding addresses, just gaps where their employment should have ended. The mirror in my room continued to show its impossible perfection, but now I noticed details I'd missed before. Sometimes, shadows moved across the reflection that had no source in my reality. Occasionally, I'd catch glimpses of furniture that wasn't in the actual room, chairs positioned at angles that suggested someone had been sitting in them moments before I looked. The second night of knocking came as promised. This time, the visitor tried speaking. The voice was conversational, friendly even. It asked about my stay, wondered if I needed anything, mentioned concerns about my well-being. It was the voice of a hotel employee, professional and courteous, exactly the kind of person you'd expect to check on a guest at a fine establishment. But it came at 3:17 a.m. I lay still, following the advice of decades of previous guests. The voice continued for nearly an hour, sometimes asking direct questions that seemed to demand responses, other times simply chatting about hotel amenities and local attractions. The tone never changed from that eerily cheerful professionalism, even as the handle turned and tested the lock again. When morning came, another letter waited after I performed the ritual with the bedspread. The voice is the hardest part. It sounds so reasonable, so human. Some guests have answered. They're found in the morning sitting in chairs that appear only in the mirror, staring at reflections that no longer match their movements. They're alive, but elsewhere. Don't listen to the words. Hum something to yourself, anything to block it out. Guest services, 1988. The pattern continued for a week. Each night brought new tests, the voice trying different tactics, the sound of multiple people conversing just outside my door, even what sounded like emergency announcements about fires or gas leaks. But I'd learned to recognize the rhythm, always beginning at 3:17 a.m., always preceded by that specific knock pattern. During the days, I found myself studying the mirror obsessively. The perfect reflection had become a source of both fascination and dread. I began to notice that my reflection sometimes lagged behind my movements by fractions of a second, or that it would complete gestures I'd only started to make. The breaking point came when I realized the reflection was showing me the room during the day exactly as it appeared at night, occupied. In the mirror's version of reality, chairs held the silhouettes of seated figures. The bed showed the impression of bodies that had lain there. The perfectly folded towels bore the slight disarray of having been used. It was as if the mirror reflected not just a cleaner version of the room, but one that was actively inhabited by guests I couldn't see. I stopped looking directly at the mirror except when absolutely necessary. But even peripheral glances confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. The reflection was showing me the hotel as it existed in some other layer of reality, one where guests still checked in and out, where the establishment continued to operate exactly as it had decades ago. The final letter appeared without my prompting. I woke one morning to find it on my pillow, written in handwriting I recognized as my own despite having no memory of creating it. They're not trying to get in anymore. They're trying to get me to come out. The mirror shows where they want me to go. Don't follow the reflection's movements. Don't do what it tells you to do. And don't look too long at the chairs in the mirror room. You might see who's sitting in them. The current caretaker. The date was tomorrow's. I stood before the mirror now, watching my reflection perform tasks I wasn't doing. The mirror me was packing a suitcase that didn't exist in my reality, moving with purpose toward a door that, in the reflection, stood wide open. Beyond that door, I could see a hallway filled with the warm light of an operational hotel, complete with other guests moving about their business. The knocking came earlier tonight. 3:16 a.m., then 3:15, then 3:14. Time was slipping, contracting toward some inevitable moment when the boundary between reflection and reality would collapse entirely. I write this now as my reflection continues packing, its movements becoming more insistent. In the mirror, the room is full of guests, translucent figures sitting in chairs, lying on the bed, standing by the window. They're all watching me with expressions I can't quite make out, their faces shifting between familiar and strange. The door handle is turning again, but this time it's not being tested from outside. In the mirror, I can see myself walking toward it, my hand extended to turn the lock. But I'm still here, sitting at this desk, writing these words. The reflection is moving independently now, completely divorced from my actions. It's opening the door to that impossible hallway filled with warmth and light, and the sounds of a hotel in its prime. The guests in the mirror chairs are standing, welcoming gestures on their faces. I understand now why the previous caretakers disappeared from the records. They didn't leave the hotel. They joined the reflection, became part of that perfect, impossible version where the grand view still operates, where guests still check in for stays that last forever. The knocking has stopped. The only sound now is my reflection calling to me from the other side of the glass, its voice exactly like mine, but filled with a contentment I haven't felt in years. It's explaining how much better things are in the mirror world, how the rooms are always clean, how the guests are always satisfied, how the work never ends because there's always someone new checking in. I can see myself in the reflection reaching for the mirror's surface from the other side, palm pressed against the glass. All I have to do is reach out and meet that touch. All I have to do is step through. The letters scattered across my desk are beginning to fade, the ink losing its supernatural freshness. Soon, there'll be nothing but yellowed paper and empty lies, just like everything else in this rotting hotel. But in the mirror, they're still crisp and new, still warm with purpose. The choice, it seems, has always been mine to make. Story 13. The first note appeared in the margins of a worn copy of The Stranger, pressed between pages that smelled of coffee and old cigarettes. My own handwriting stared back at me from the yellowed paper, neat and urgent. Don't answer at 4:04. I hadn't written it. The discovery came during my usual Tuesday evening routine at the downtown public library, where I'd been seeking refuge from the suffocating silence of my apartment. The building's fluorescent lights hummed with a persistent frequency that seemed to match the rhythm of my increasingly erratic heartbeat. I'd grabbed the Camus novel from the returns cart, drawn to its familiar weight and the promise of losing myself in existential dread that wasn't my own. But there it was, my handwriting, unmistakable in its careful slant, and the way the ink pressed deeper at the end of each word. The same way I'd written grocery lists and rent checks for 32 years. The same way I'd signed divorce papers 6 months ago. I flipped through more pages, my fingers trembling slightly as they traced the edges of the text. More notes emerged, like secrets whispered in the dark. The ceiling in the east corridor. Don't look up. They know you're reading this. Check your phone at exactly 11:47 p.m. Each annotation bore the unmistakable characteristics of my penmanship, yet I remembered none of them. The ink appeared fresh, the indentations still visible on the paper beneath. Someone had written these recently, someone who knew exactly how I formed my letters, how I dotted my I's with small, precise circles. The librarian at the circulation desk, a thin woman with wire-rimmed glasses that reflected the overhead lights, processed my checkout with mechanical efficiency. When I asked about the book's recent return history, she informed me it had been checked out only once in the past month. By me, 3 weeks ago. That night, I spread the book across my kitchen table under the harsh glare of the pendant light, studying each margin note as if they were evidence in a crime I couldn't remember committing. The warnings felt both foreign and intimately familiar, like hearing my voice played back on a recording. My apartment's radiator clanked and hissed in the background, providing an unsettling soundtrack to my investigation. At 11:47 p.m. exactly, my phone buzzed, a text message from an unknown number. You found the first one. I stared at the screen until the display dimmed, then brightened again as another message arrived. There are more. Sleep came in fragments that night, interrupted by the persistent feeling that I was being watched from the shadows beyond my bedroom door. Every creak of the building's old bones sent jolts of adrenaline through my system, and I found myself checking the locks on my apartment door twice, then 3 times, before finally collapsing into an uneasy rest. The next morning brought fog that clung to the city like a gray shroud, muffling sounds and distorting familiar landmarks. I arrived at the library 30 minutes before opening, pacing the sidewalk outside until the staff unlocked the heavy glass doors. The east corridor stretched before me like a tunnel, its ceiling marked by water stains that seemed to shift and writhe in my peripheral vision. I forced my gaze downward, remembering the warning, and made my way to the return section with measured steps. 3 more books waited for me: a collection of Poe stories, a meditation guide, and a local history of the city's founding families. Each contained annotations in my handwriting, each more specific and urgent than the last. "The man in the blue coat is following you," read one note tucked into "The Telltale Heart." "He's been 3 steps behind since you left your apartment." I spun around, scanning the sparse crowd of morning patrons. An elderly man in a navy pea coat stood near the periodicals, his back turned toward me as he flipped through a magazine. When he shifted his weight, I caught a glimpse of his profile. Angular features I didn't recognize, yet something about the curve of his jaw felt disturbingly familiar. The meditation guide contained breathing exercises annotated with warnings about holding my breath too long. "Count to 7, not 8. 8 opens the door." The local history book was filled with names of families I'd never heard of, but my handwriting had circled several surnames and connected them with thin, spidery lines that formed a pattern resembling a family tree, or a web. Days blended into one another as I returned to the library with increasing frequency, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name or resist. Each visit revealed new books with fresh annotations, warnings that grew more personal and immediate. My handwriting began to feel like messages from a future self, desperate to prevent something terrible from unfolding. "Don't drink the coffee from the machine on the 2nd floor. The woman with the red scarf knows your real name. At 3:33 a.m., someone will try your door handle. Pretend to be asleep." True to the warning, at 3:33 a.m. exactly, I heard the soft metallic click of my door handle being tested from the outside. I lay motionless in my bed, every muscle tense, listening to the sound of footsteps retreating down the hallway. In the morning, I found no evidence of the intrusion, but the memory of that gentle, probing touch on my door handle lingered like a bruise. The annotations became increasingly urgent, the handwriting more frantic. "They're using your face now. Don't trust mirrors after midnight. The recordings prove everything." "What recordings?" I searched my apartment, my computer, my phone, finding nothing unusual. Yet the feeling of being documented, of having my every movement cataloged and analyzed, grew stronger each day. I began to notice patterns in the strangers I encountered, the way they looked at me with eyes that seemed to hold recognition, as if they knew something about me that I'd forgotten. The library's east corridor became a source of particular dread. The water stains on the ceiling had definitely changed, forming shapes that resembled faces when viewed from certain angles. I caught myself glancing upward despite the warnings, unable to resist the pull of those ambiguous patterns. Sometimes, I swore I could see features shifting in the discolored plaster, a mouth that curved into something approaching a smile, eyes that seemed to track my movement down the hallway. My sleep became increasingly fragmented, punctuated by dreams where I sat in the library writing notes in books I'd never read, my hand moving with mechanical precision, while a voice that sounded like mine whispered warnings about events that hadn't happened yet. I would wake with cramped fingers and the taste of library dust in my mouth. The phone calls began exactly as the first annotation had predicted. At 4:04 a.m., my phone would ring, displaying no caller ID. On the other end, only breathing, slow, measured, patient. The sound carried an intimacy that made my skin crawl, as if the caller was someone who knew me well enough to match the rhythm of my own respiration. I stopped answering after the 3rd night, but could still hear the phone vibrating against my nightstand, a persistent reminder that someone wanted to reach me at that precise moment. 3 weeks into this routine, I discovered the journal, hidden behind a row of dusty encyclopedias on the library's 3rd floor, a composition notebook filled with my handwriting. Page after page of observations about my daily routines, detailed descriptions of my apartment, transcripts of conversations I'd had with coworkers and neighbors. The entries were dated over the past 2 months, chronicling a life I was living but couldn't remember documenting. Subject continues to visit library Tuesday evenings. Read one entry. Show signs of confusion when confronted with written evidence. Memory gaps becoming more pronounced. Subject responding well to planted suggestions. Noted another. Phone calls at 4:04 a.m. producing desired anxiety response. Ready for phase 2. The handwriting was unmistakably mine, but the clinical detachment of the observations made me feel like a specimen under examination. According to the journal, I had been studying myself, documenting my own behavior with the methodical precision of a researcher observing a test subject. But I remembered none of it. The final entries grew increasingly disturbing. Subject beginning to question reality of experiences. Excellent progress. Memory suppression working as intended. Subject has no recollection of volunteering for study. Tonight, subject will discover this journal. Curious to observe reaction. I slammed the notebook closed, my hands shaking as I looked around the empty third floor. The silence felt oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of ventilation systems and the soft whisper of pages being turned somewhere below. How had I known I would find this journal tonight? How had I predicted my own shock and confusion? The man in the blue coat stood at the far end of the stacks, watching me with eyes that reflected the overhead lights like coins. When I blinked, he was gone, leaving only the gentle sway of a hanging plant near the window. I ran home through streets that seemed subtly wrong, as if someone had rearranged familiar landmarks by inches, creating a world that looked right but felt fundamentally off-kilter. My apartment building's lobby smelled different, less like cleaning solution, and more like the musty air of old books. The elevator's buttons felt unusually warm under my fingertips. In my bathroom mirror, my reflection appeared to be delayed by a fraction of a second, my movements echoing rather than synchronizing. I avoided looking directly at the glass, remembering the warning about mirrors after midnight, though I couldn't recall exactly why that time was significant. My phone buzzed. Phase 2 complete. Prepare for integration. I stared at the message until the screen went dark, then watched my reflected face appear in the black surface. For just a moment, my reflection seemed to be looking back at me with an expression of satisfied completion, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. The final annotation waited for me the next morning, written in red ink across the margin of a book I'd never seen before. Welcome home. You wrote all of this. You always knew you wrote all of this. The study is complete. But I hadn't written it. I was certain I hadn't written it. Wasn't I? The certainty began to crumble as I stared at the familiar curves and angles of my own handwriting, at the way the red ink caught the library's fluorescent light. My hand moved unconsciously to my pocket, where I found a red pen I didn't remember purchasing. The ink was still wet. Story 14. The notice appeared on a Tuesday morning, taped to every door in the building, with the kind of precision that suggested our building manager, Mr. Henley, had stayed up late measuring distances. The paper was cream-colored, expensive-looking, with text printed in an elegant serif font that seemed more suited to wedding invitations than apartment bulletins. Dear residents, please ensure all doors remain securely locked between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. We have been receiving reports of courteous visits during evening hours. While these visits are conducted with the utmost respect for our community, we ask that you do not answer your door during this time frame for the comfort and safety of all residents. Thank you for your cooperation. Building management. I read it twice, standing in my doorway with my coffee growing cold. Courteous visits. The phrase sat oddly in my mouth, like a word repeated until it lost all meaning. I'd lived in the Meridian Apartments for 3 years, and the most excitement we'd ever had was Mrs. Chen's cat getting stuck in the ventilation system. The building housed 42 units across 6 floors, a modest brick structure wedged between a dry cleaner and a used bookstore. Most tenants were young professionals like myself, people who appreciated the affordable rent and didn't ask too many questions about the occasional strange noise or the way the elevator sometimes stopped on floors no one had pressed. That evening, I made sure to lock my door at 9:45 p.m., though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was preparing for something I didn't understand. My apartment faced the interior courtyard, and from my living room window, I could see into several other units. The building had always felt intimate in that way. You knew when your neighbors were cooking dinner, when they stayed up late watching television, when they had guests over. At exactly 10:01 p.m., I heard the first chime. It was delicate, crystalline, like the sound of wind chimes on a breezeless night. The melody drifted through my apartment walls with impossible clarity, as if the sound were coming from inside my own space. I checked my windows, all closed. I had no wind chimes, had never owned any. Yet the gentle tinkling continued for nearly a minute before fading into silence. I pressed my ear to the wall shared with my neighbor's apartment. The sound seemed to be coming from there, from Unit 4B where the elderly man lived. Henderson, I thought his name was. I'd seen him in the lobby occasionally, always impeccably dressed despite his obvious age, always nodding politely when our paths crossed. The building fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Expectant, waiting. Then came the knocking. It started on the floor above me, a soft, rhythmic tapping that moved with deliberate slowness. Tap, 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 starting high on what I imagined was someone's door, then moving down in measured intervals. Tap, 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 lower now. Tap, 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 lower still. The pattern repeated, methodical and patient, as if someone were conducting a careful survey of the door's dimensions. I moved to my own door and placed my palm against the cool wood. The knocking above stopped, and for a moment, the building held its breath. Then I heard it again, closer now, on my floor, moving down the hallway with that same measured cadence. The sound approached my door, and I found myself stepping backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the peephole, the hallway appeared empty, lit by the same flickering fluorescent bulb that had needed replacing for months. But the knocking continued, and I could feel the vibrations through the door itself. Tap, tap, tap at the top of my door frame. Tap, 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 maybe 6 inches lower. Tap, 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 continuing downward in perfect intervals. I remained frozen, hardly breathing, until the sound moved past my apartment and continued down the hall. It paused at each door, repeating the same vertical pattern before moving on. The entire process took nearly 20 minutes, and by the time it reached the end of the corridor, my hands were trembling. The next morning I found the gift. It sat on my welcome mat like an offering, a small brass key, tarnished with age, attached to no keychain or ring. The key was ornate, with an elaborate bow that featured tiny engravings too small to decipher. I picked it up, noting its surprising weight, and tried to remember if I'd ever seen a lock that might match its unusual design. None of my neighbors seemed to be around that morning, which struck me as odd. Usually the hallways bustled with people heading to work, but today, the building felt abandoned. I knocked on Henderson's door, thinking I might ask him about the wind chimes, but got no response. I spent the day at work trying to focus on spreadsheets and quarterly reports, but my mind kept drifting back to the key. I'd placed it on my kitchen counter, and even from my office downtown, I could almost feel its presence in my apartment. The weight of it, the way it seemed to watch me through the walls. That evening, Mr. Henley was waiting in the lobby when I returned. He stood near the mailboxes, his usual nervous energy amplified. His gray hair was disheveled, and his typically crisp shirt showed wrinkles. "You got your notice, I assume?" he asked without preamble. I nodded. "About the courteous visits. What exactly does that mean?" Henley's eyes darted toward the elevator, then back to me. "Some things are better left unexamined. Just keep your door locked. Don't answer if anyone knocks after 10. And if you find anything outside your door in the morning, well..." He trailed off, shrugging in a way that suggested he'd given up trying to make sense of it himself. Find anything like what? But he was already walking away, his footsteps echoing off the lobby's marble floor with unusual sharpness. The second night, I was ready. I positioned myself near the door at 9:55 p.m., notepad in hand, determined to document whatever was happening. The building manager's evasiveness had only intensified my curiosity, and the mysterious key sat heavy in my pocket like a talisman. The wind chimes began again at 10:01, but this time I was certain they were coming from multiple apartments. The sound layered and harmonized, creating a melody that seemed almost purposeful. I pressed my ear to different walls, trying to triangulate the sources, but the music appeared to emanate from everywhere at once. When the knocking started, I grabbed my phone and tried to record it, but the audio came out silent, just 20 minutes of ambient room tone, as if the sounds existed only for those present to hear them. This time, when the methodical tapping reached my door, I looked through the peephole immediately. The hallway stretched empty in both directions, but the vibrations against the door continued. I watched the space directly in front of my apartment, seeing nothing, while feeling each deliberate knock resonate through the wood and into my bones. As the sound moved away, I noticed something else. Wet footprints on the hallway carpet. Not muddy or dirty, just damp impressions of bare feet. Impossibly small. Child-sized, though that was impossible. There were no children in the building. The prints led from the elevator to the end of the hallway, stopping at each door where the knocking had occurred. By morning, the footprints had dried and disappeared, but my gift had arrived, a small framed photograph showing the hallway outside my apartment. The image was taken from the perspective of someone standing exactly where I'd been looking through the peephole. In the photograph, a figure stood in my doorway, a dark silhouette that was unmistakably me, looking out. But I remembered the hallway being empty. I remembered being alone. The photograph's frame was antique silver, tarnished around the edges, and the back bore an inscription in faded blue ink. "Thank you for waiting." I started avoiding the other tenants. When I encountered Henderson in the elevator, he smiled and nodded as always, but something in his eyes seemed different. Knowing. Mrs. Chen from 2A waved when she saw me collecting my mail, but her gesture lingered too long, her fingers tracing patterns in the air that made my skin crawl. Even my own reflection began to feel suspicious. In the bathroom mirror, in the dark windows of my apartment, in the polished surfaces of the elevator, I started noticing delays, as if my reflection were a half-second behind my movements. Sometimes I'd catch it moving when I wasn't, adjusting its position while I stood perfectly still. The third night, I almost didn't lock my door. The thought came suddenly and with surprising intensity. What if I just left it unlocked? What if I answered when the knocking came? The idea felt both terrifying and irresistibly appealing, like standing at the edge of a cliff and feeling the urge to jump. I forced myself to turn the deadbolt, then checked it 3 times to make sure it had caught properly. My hands were shaking again, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. At 10:01, the wind chimes began, but tonight they played a different melody. Sadder somehow, more complex. The harmonies wove together in ways that suggested multiple instruments, though I knew the sounds came from simple chimes. The music built to crescendos that made my chest ache, then dropped to whispers that seemed to speak directly into my ear. When the knocking came, it was different too. Faster, more urgent. The measured intervals had been replaced by a frantic rhythm that suggested someone, or something, was running out of time. The tapping moved down my door quickly, then started again at the top, repeating the pattern over and over. Through the peephole, I saw nothing. But this time, I opened the door. The decision surprised me as much as it would have surprised anyone watching. One moment I was standing safely inside my apartment. The next I was turning the deadbolt and pulling the door open. The hallway stretched before me, empty and fluorescent lit, but the air itself felt thick, almost viscous. The knocking stopped. I stepped into the hallway, my bare feet finding the carpet oddly warm, the building's usual sounds. Humming fluorescents, distant traffic, the mechanical whisper of climate control had been replaced by something else. A low frequency that I felt more than heard, vibrating through the floor and into my bones. At the end of the hallway near the emergency exit, something moved. It wasn't walking so much as flowing, a presence that seemed to reshape itself as it approached. In the poor lighting, details remained elusive, but I caught impressions. Impossibly tall, wearing what might have been clothing but could have been shadows, moving with liquid grace down the corridor. It stopped directly in front of me. We regarded each other in the flickering fluorescent light, and I realized that what I'd taken for a face was actually an absence, a space where features should have been but weren't. The presence tilted its head, studying me with attention I could feel like weight against my skin. Then it smiled. I'm certain it smiled, though it had no mouth. The expression was communicated through intent rather than expression, through a sudden warmth that flooded the hallway and made my knees weak. It was the smile of someone meeting an old friend, of someone who had been waiting patiently for this moment. The presence reached into what might have been a pocket and withdrew something small and bright. A key. But this one was different from the brass key I'd found the previous morning. This one seemed to be made of light itself, glowing with soft blue radiance. It offered the key to me, and without thinking, I reached out to accept it. The moment my fingers touched the warm metal, the hallway disappeared. I was standing in my apartment again, door closed and locked, deadbolts secure. My hand was empty. The digital clock on my microwave read 6:23 a.m., though I had no memory of the hours between opening my door and finding myself back inside. On my kitchen counter, next to the brass key from the previous morning, sat a small folded note. The paper was the same cream color as Mr. Henley's original notice, but the handwriting was different. Spidery, elegant script that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at it. Thank you for waiting. The keys will make sense soon. Please keep your door unlocked tomorrow night. We have so much to discuss. With appreciation, your courteous visitors. I read the note 17 times before I finally understood that I had a choice to make. I could continue locking my door, continue pretending that what was happening wasn't real, continue living in the growing space between sanity and something else. Or I could trust the visitors who left gifts and played wind chimes and knocked on doors with the patience of those who existed outside of time. The brass key felt warm in my pocket. The photograph sat on my counter, showing a version of myself I didn't remember being, and somewhere in the building, I could hear the faint sound of wind chimes, playing even though it was morning, even though there was no wind. Tonight I think I'll leave my door unlocked. After all, they've been so very courteous.